Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming out on this wonderful Saturday. Nice, dry. It is warm outside, at least. Yeah. I was expecting to freeze when I came to Michigan. We brought Texas weather with us, I suppose. Really happy that you're here, and we are happy to be here as well. I tell every place I go, I tell the people that it's a gift for me to be able to do what I do, to be able to travel around and teach the scriptures, to proclaim the gospel, and to be among my brothers and sisters in Christ, to rejoice in the grace that we all have received in Christ. So I'm thankful for the chance to work for 1517, to be able to teach, to be able to revel in the good news that we have in Christ, and to do it with all of you. So thanks for being here today. So we're talking about Jacob today. Jacob is a fascinating individual, needless to say. But to get us kind of thinking about the life of Jacob, I want you to think with me about heroes for a minute. I think we all grew up, at least us guys, I can't speak for gals. I still haven't been able to figure out women. But for all us guys, when we're young, we need a hero, right? Am I wrong? As a young guy, you're looking up to older guys for some sort of model, some sort of hero. And I was like that. So I'm almost 55. I was born in 1970, in the 1900s, so long ago. And I was raised by a cowboy. My dad, Carson, who's been with our Lord for over 2 years now, was born in the wrong century. He should have been born in the 1800s because he would have been very much at home working on a ranch somewhere in the West when there were still cowboys and Indians and all that stuff going on. But I was raised on horseback. I learned to ride a horse before I could ride a bicycle. My dad and I were team ropers, lived out in the country. It was a wonderful upbringing. And my dad was one of my heroes, as was his dad, my granddad. Looked up to both of them, and they're both with our Lord. And my dad, maybe because he was a cowboy, he loved the novels by Louis L'Amour. Anybody out there Louis L'Amour fans? Yeah, there's always a few hands. So if those of you who don't know him, he's probably the most well-known Western writer who's ever lived. So we had all his books. And I grew up reading those multiple times, in fact. So my heroes from the Louis L'Amour novels were any guesses? The family? The Sacketts, yeah. Logan Sackett and Barnabas Sackett and Jubal Sackett and all these guys who were larger than life. So if you think about the characters in these kinds of novels, and not just the Louis L'Amour novels, a lot of novels like this that are kind of patterned after the Greek model, you have these heroic characters who never lose. They're like superhuman. I mean, one of the Sackett guys could get shot 3 or 4 times, bucked off his horse, beat up, fall off a cliff, and by the end of the book, he has taken out the bad guy. He owns a ranch, and he's got the most beautiful girl in the county by his side. That's just always the way this works. Now, when I was a young boy reading these books, I was fascinated by this, and I found within these characters someone that I wanted to emulate. Maybe not in the exact same way, but I wanted to win. I wanted to achieve. I wanted to get great success. I wanted to overcome all odds and obstacles that were in my way. I wanted to be a heroic character myself. And I also wanted to be, if you kind of set aside the novels, I wanted to be a heroic character like my dad and my granddad were to me. Young boys, and I suppose young girls as well, need heroes, people that we can look up to. Now, that was when I was young. One of the things you begin to discover over time is that, as we often say, never meet your heroes. Because it turns out all of your heroes are flesh and blood creatures with issues, problems, vices, skeletons, sometimes big closets full of skeletons. So one of the things I have discovered over the course of my 55 years is that a lot of people that I looked up to as heroic characters when I was younger, they had another side to them. And some of these were members of my own family, like my dad and my granddad. You know, there were a lot of things you don't know as a kid, which is great. You don't need to know those. But when you're an adult, you find out certain things, you know, and it turns out they were sinners, just like all of us. And there's things that I didn't know about that I learned later on. It didn't change my opinion of them. It just kind of gave me a bigger perspective on my heroes. And I suppose if I could actually spend time, if the Sacketts were real guys and I spent time with them, I would discover the same thing. And it's like that with the family history that I know. I grew up, my dad was big into our family tree, and he traced it back to the 1700s, and there was a guy named Mark Bird, kind of a big-time guy, a rich guy in Pennsylvania during the Revolutionary War, and I think he was a hero for my dad. Well, I found out over the course of time that he was also a terrible businessman who basically lost the family's wealth after the Revolutionary War. So there's another side to him as well. All our families, even the people we look up to, well, there's always kind of an ugly side to them. Now, I know this doesn't apply to any of us in the room at all. Certainly not to me. There's nothing in my past that is troublesome. No, we're all like that. There's a double side to us. Now, why do I bring all this up? I bring all this up because I think that we tend to take our view of heroes, or even famous people in general that we look up to for whatever reason, and we read that into the biblical text. And we read about these famous people like Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Moses and Aaron and David and Joshua and all of these guys, and these gals too. We tend to read them as if they're heroes. And when we do that, it skews our understanding of exactly who they are. In fact, we tend to read them from just one perspective. Oh, look at this great thing that they did. Oh, look what God did through them. Look at this wonderful thing that they said. Now, there's plenty of wonderful things they did and plenty of wonderful things that God did through them and plenty of wonderful things they said. But that's all the kind of Sunday school stuff that many of us grew up with. There's a whole other side to most of these characters. There's things that I didn't learn in Sunday school that I've discovered that's like it's in the Bible, but we just kind of skimmed over that. That now you read it and you're like, wow, that's in the Bible? Yeah, it turns out it was there all along. I just didn't know it. So, number one, when we approach these characters, do not, like Jacob or any of the other ones, do not view them as heroes. View them as ordinary, flesh and blood sinners, just like all of us. Now, I guarantee you this will revolutionize your reading the biblical text. Because very often, if we don't treat them as heroes, we treat them as literary characters in an old religious novel. And when you do that, number one, you're divorcing them from the history in which they lived. You're not treating them as real people. And you're forgetting that they actually are real people. Like the people that are sitting with you at a table, or the people that live in your house, or your neighbors, or your co-workers, or your fellow churchgoers. Now, when you begin to treat the biblical characters as real historical people, that changes the way you read the biblical story as well. Because you begin to understand them not as characters in an old religious novel, but as flesh and blood people who have multiple sides to them, who have personalities, who do stupid things, who act in selfish ways, who do things for the wrong reasons, who are in the midst of family messes, who have troubled marriages, who have their own skeletons in their closet. And the more that you begin to read the biblical characters that way and understand they're multifaceted, they're not heroes, they're not these superhuman moral exemplars, but they're just regular folks. The more you begin to read the Bible in that way, the more you begin to understand it's not the Old Testament because it's ever new, because these people are just like we are. They're no different. You think that your marriage is troubled at times? Have you read about the biblical marriages? I mean, have you ever traveled to Egypt and while you're there told everyone your wife was actually your sister? And come to think of it, is your wife your half-sister? If she is, I really want to have a conversation during the break. I'd love to hear about that. That's Abraham and Isaac, right? Or, I mean, we're not even going to get into the life of David. Talk about a mess. I mean, he's great up to a point, and then once you get to that point, then everything about David just is this downward spiral. After Uriah and Bathsheba, forget it. David is just a troubled soul. But he's also the greatest king that Israel ever had, right? My point is this. When we're reading about Jacob, or when you're reading about any biblical character, tell yourself this is a real person with a real personality, with real problems and real struggles, some more than others. And then you're going to be getting to the real beauty of the biblical story. Because the real beauty of the biblical story is that there's only one hero in the Bible, and it's God. Specifically, it's Jesus Christ. He is the heroic character, no one else. And this heroic character, turns out, chooses weak, vice-ridden, skeletons in the closet kinds of folks in order that through their weakness he might demonstrate his strength. Through all of their failures and all of their stupid decisions and all of their selfish actions, God is still at work. Through their dysfunctional families like Jacob's, God is still there in the fullness of his grace to be active in their lives, to do for them what they can't do for themselves, and to work through them in a way that they couldn't work themselves. And this same God, this same hero, Jesus Christ, is present in our midst. He's here today. And he's active in your life and in your marriage and in your family with all the struggles that you have, with all the pains that you endure, with all the possible dysfunction and addiction that plagues you or your family. That doesn't scare Jesus away. He comes walking right into the midst of that mess saying, this is the situation that I can work with. Jesus works best with sinners. That's the only material he has to work with. And the Bible is one long record of Jesus working with sinners. Sinners who often do things that are very embarrassing, that if we did them, we would cower in shame. And sometimes we do. But also, God continues to love them and to forgive them and to uphold them and to use them as part of his ongoing salvation story. And that ongoing salvation story is still ongoing. Your life is a biblical life. Yes, I know that Revelation is the last chapter in the Bible, but the biblical story continues. The salvation story continues. You're living it. Every single one of us is still living the outflowing salvation story, which is not going to end until Christ returns. So you're living a biblical story. You're part of the salvation story because God is still active in your life to give you his salvation and to use you in all of your weak and faltering and sinful ways to be a blessing to other people. Just like he's done for me, he continues to do for all of you as well. So when we get into Jacob, which we will do in just a second, when we get into Jacob, I want you to think of Jacob as a guy sitting at your table, or a guy that you work with, or a guy that's in your neighborhood. Think of him as a real person, and all the characters in that way. And the more that you do, the more you're going to appreciate all of the eccentricities of his personality, let's put it that way. as well as how God chose him to work through him from the beginning all the way to the end of his life. So there's a lot that we can talk about with Jacob. We're not going to be able to cover his whole life. There's a book called, Limping with God. It's going to cover all of those details. But we're going to highlight a few things. And we're going to start at the beginning, Genesis 25. Jacob's story is so easy, you just turn to the very middle of Genesis, right? That's where it all starts. So his story basically is going to comprise Genesis 25 through the rest of Genesis. And one of the uniquenesses about Jacob is that I think that we probably know more about him than we do almost any other biblical character. Well, let's just get into it. Where do we meet him? When do we first meet Jacob? Is he like kindergarten age or something? Is he 20? He's in the womb. Yeah. We literally meet him in utero. That's where you get to meet Jacob. And that's in Genesis 25. You can turn there now. Genesis 25, beginning around verse 22 is where we'll start. So we know him from utero, and then we travel through him with some gaps, here and there. But we travel with him all the way to where he's an old man in Egypt. We actually get to see him in this long funeral procession from Egypt all the way back to the Promised Land where he's buried. So we get to see him from beginning to end. We get to walk around him and see the many sides of Jacob. And one of the things we discover right away, and we see this actually in this opening story of his conception and his time in the womb, is that Jacob is a problem child, like right away. So this is 20 years into the marriage of Isaac and Rebekah. They had to wait a while, 2 decades. But finally, when Isaac prays, then Rebekah conceives. And verse 22 tells us this. The children struggled within her, and she said, if this is so, then why am I this way? The Hebrew there is kind of strange. It's like she's stuttering. She's just, what's going on? I mean, I don't understand. It's kind of like that. What's happening within me? This is before sonogram. She doesn't even know she has twins, right? It's not like she went to the doctor and they're like, well, that's the reason you've got these boys within you. No, she doesn't know. So she inquires of God, and the Lord said to her, well, here's the deal. 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 people shall be separated from your body, and one people shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. Let's keep reading here for a second. When her days to be delivered were fulfilled, behold, there were twins in her womb, and the first came forth red, all over like a hairy garment, and they named him the ugliest child that year. Nice. So, named him Esau, but he would have won the prize. And afterward, his brother came forth with his hand holding on to Esau's heel. And so his name was called Jacob, Yaakov in Hebrew. And Isaac was 60 years old when she gave birth to them. So what's one of the first things we discover about these 2 kids, these 2 brothers in the womb? They fight. Yeah. The Hebrew there is ratzatz. And it's not just like, these aren't your normal, ladies, help me out here. What are you feeling when you're pregnant? What is that called? Fat. This is not your normal fat. Yeah. This is not the normal movement of the child. Oh, yes. This is like, what is going on? There's like a fight going on in my womb. They're like ratzatzing together. They're hitting together. It's a violent word that's being used here. These kids are already fighting in the womb. Already. And it turns out that, I don't know about Esau, but certainly Jacob is not going to stop fighting. Everybody he meets, he fights in one way or another. He's certainly fighting with his brother from the womb onward, right? He's going to, in a sense, fight with his father because he's going to deceive him. We'll talk about that later. And then he's going to fight with his uncle, boss, father-in-law, all rolled into one. Laban is going to fight with him, right? Jacob is a fighter. He's He's not, even though he's called a man of peace at some point, he's not very peaceful. He's always struggling. He's always fighting. And these kids they're already fighting in the womb. And this fight is going to expand over time because, of course, Jacob will become Israel, and Israel will become a nation, and Esau will become Edom, and that will become a nation too. So you have the Israelites and you have the Edomites, and if you know anything about biblical history, there's more rotsatzing. There's more struggling going on between these two groups of people as the history unfolds. And that's exactly, of course, what the Lord tells Rebekah when he gives her this prophecy of two peoples coming forth from your womb. Now, one of the things that we need to point out here, and this is kind of coming from a New Testament perspective, Paul in the letter to the Romans, what was it about Jacob in the womb that really attracted God's attention? He's like, that kid, man, he's so good in the womb. He's so moral in the womb. He's just like, there's something about him. There's just a spiritual glow in the womb. I'm going to choose him over Esau. No, there's nothing like that at all. Paul will say before they had done anything good or bad, before Jacob could prove that he was a spiritual superior to Esau, which, by the way, he never did, before any of that, God said, Jacob, I'm going to choose. Don't you love that? God's choice of you is not dependent upon your spiritual or moral or ethical pedigree. God didn't choose you to be his child because you were so good. And if you think that's why he chose you, then you're dead wrong. That's one more reason that God didn't choose you, is because of the supposed goodness that you have. He chose you because of his grace. He chose you because he's a good and gracious God who wanted you to be his child. In fact, he chose you despite your pedigree, despite all the despicable things that you've wanted, desired, spoken, done. Despite all that, he chose you. Same with Jacob. Despite the fact that he's as we'll learn, a backstabber and a liar and a blasphemer and an overall just terrible person in many ways, I think Esau is a much better person. I think if I wanted a friend, it would be Esau. He'd be a good hunting buddy, right? But Jacob, I probably wouldn't choose. But God did. Because God doesn't choose you based upon how good you are, but how good he is. He doesn't choose you because he sees great spiritual potential in you. He chooses you because he sees you through the lens of Christ. He loves you before he even looks at you. And when he loves you, then you become lovely in his eyes. Same with Jacob, same with us still today. Now, when these kids are born, well, we heard about Esau, ugly kid. And I'm sorry if any of your children came out covered in red hair. I'm not trying to insult your child, but he was ugly. So Esau, the name itself is connected with a Hebrew word that means hair, and so he basically means hairy, right? And then Jacob's name comes from what? What was he doing? He was grasping the heel. Yeah. So Yaakov is like the word for heel in Hebrew, because he was grabbing hold of his brother. Now, why was he grabbing hold of his brother's heel? What was he trying to do? He was trying to get back in here. I want out first. Yeah. His nativity is already a prophecy of his personality. When he's born, everything you need to know about Jacob, we could close the Bible and go home right now. Everything you need to know about Jacob has already been revealed to us. Jacob, at least in the first half of his life, is all about getting ahead. Jacob is a baby driven by ambition. And he grows into a young man and then to a middle-aged man who that fuel of ambition is still burning hot within him because he wants to get ahead, especially his brother. He wants to be first. Jacob is all about Jacob. And for that reason, I love to refer to Jacob as the very first historical American. Very first one. Because I love America. I'm not unpatriotic here, but if there's anything about America that drives me nuts is that we're all about number one. And I don't mean America number one. I'm talking about me number one or you number one, right? It's all about this individual. What do you want? Life is all about you. Self this, self that. Well, that's Jacob too. Self Jacob. Jacob was all about himself. Jacob was the navel gazer, as we describe it. He was always looking inward, always looking at himself. And we see this already happening here where he tries to get ahead of his brother. So he's named Heel. I don't understand parents back then. I mean, did you not talk about what you're going to name the kids before? I mean, John, maybe John and Henry, I don't know. They wait till like the birth. It's like, oh, that one's red, a lot of hair. Let's call him Harry. Well, that kid, man, he was grabbing all that heel. Let's call him Heel. So we have the brothers Harry and Heel. I guess it works, right? I guess it works. So they have their names, and in a sense, they kind of have their destiny. Jacob certainly has his destiny because he's not just a heel, but the verb that's connected with the name for Jacob means to grab or to trip up. I told you I was raised by a cowboy. My dad, Carson, taught me how to rope steers at an early age. Any steer ropers in the room? Oh, come on. Nobody? So you know what steer roping is like. You have a header and you have a heeler, right? And so the steer goes out of the chute. The header ropes the horns, ideally. He dallies, he turns, and he's dragging the steer, and the heeler comes along, and the heeler throws the rope so that it goes around in front of the back legs of the steer, and then he pulls it, and then ideally you get him caught by the horns, you get him caught by his two back legs. That's a heeler. That heeler is Jacobing. That's what Jacob does. He throws that rope, or he throws that lie, or he throws that scheme of his to trip up somebody else. That's Jacob's personality. Well, why would Jacob do that? Because Jacob is all about Jacob. He's all about getting ahead. And whatever it takes, that's exactly what Jacob is going to do. That's what ambition does. I know, because for the first, 3.5 decades of my life, I was an addict to ambition. That was my drug of choice. It was all about getting ahead. It was all about planning and plotting and scheming to get what I wanted. And here's the thing, it worked. It actually worked. I got exactly what I wanted. Dreams come true. And it happens a lot of times when you get exactly what you want, guess what happens? It all comes crumbling down. That's what happened with me. I lost everything. Drugs of all varieties, I don't care if it's lust for you, or I don't care if it's alcohol or drugs or ambition, as it was for me, they always lead to a big crash and burn eventually. So that's what happened with me. I realized that ambition, selfish ambition, drove me to the point where I was the kind of person where God looked at me and he's like, you know what that guy really needs? To be crushed. To be crushed. Which usually happens to us at least once in our lives. Yeah, it's a terrible, terrible thing to experience, painful thing to experience, very humbling, humiliating, a lot of loss, a lot of pain, and it's the best possible thing that could ever happen to you. You won't think that when it's happening, but you will realize that later. To be pushed down, to have that ballooning ego popped by the Spirit of God, and then to be reduced down to where you're just kind of these broken pieces, and then God looks at you and he's like, now there's something I can work with. Because God's favorite material to work with is nothing. That's how he created the heavens and the earth, right? In the beginning there was nothing. We have the Latin phrase ex nihilo, meaning from nothing. That's how God made everything. God's favorite choice of working material to build something is nothing. And that wasn't just how God started, that continues to be how God works. So the less there is of us, the more God has to work with. The more there is of us, the less God has to work with. So God will reduce us down. He will remove that drain at the bottom of your soul and let all of that icky stuff drain out. And when it's empty, then God says, all right, now I can do something. So God has this way of reducing us down to nothing in order that he can actually work with us. The less there is of me, the more room there is for Jesus. The less there is of pride and ambition and lust and envy and anger and all that nasty stuff that we love, the less there is of that, then the more room there is for the Spirit to do his work within us. So that's what's going to eventually happen to Jacob. That's what happened to me as well. Thanks be to God. All right. Now, we learn a little bit about, back to the text. We learn a little bit about these guys. We're not told a lot about their upbringing, but we are told in verse 27 that when the boys grew up, that Esau consistently wore camouflage. That's exactly what it says in the Hebrew. Just kidding. But we're told that he was a skillful hunter, all right? A man of the field. What do we call him today? He's a man's man, right? He drives a pickup, obviously. Wears camo, maybe he's packing all the time, but he's definitely got the gun rack. And first day of deer season, you know where Esau is going to be found. That's the kind of guy he is. And then there's Jacob. We're told that Jacob was, some translations have peaceful man. And then he's living in tents. That means he was a shepherd. That expression, living in tents, is used elsewhere to describe a shepherd, which makes sense because that's the vocation he will have later on, right? He's a shepherd. He's taking care of his father-in-law's sheep. So you got Jacob, who's kind of a mama's boy, as we'll learn. And then you have Esau, who's a daddy's boy, a hunter. But right away, you're realizing, okay, we got twins, but they're definitely not identical twins. I mean, there's difference not only the way they look, but there's differences with regard to their lifestyle. Okay? And then there's one more thing here. Verse 28, I like to point out. Isaac loved Esau because he had a taste for game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Do you ever realize just how shallow that is? So you're having a conversation with Isaac. So tell me about your boys. Well, I got two. I got Jacob. He's a shepherd. Then I got Esau. Man, I'm proud of that kid. He's quite the hunter. It's like, well, Isaac sounds like maybe he's your favorite. He's like, yeah, I really like how he cooks. That's it. I mean, that's his favorite because he likes what he cooks. It's culinary favorite is the reason he chooses Esau as his favorite. We're also learning here that there's some family dynamics going on here. We got favorites. We got mama's favorite, and we got daddy's favorite. And as we'll see in not the next chapter, the chapter after that, this is going to lead to issues, big issues, right? And this isn't going to stop in this generation because if you fast forward in your biblical mind to later in Genesis, who plays favorites? In fact, who chooses one of the sons and wants to make sure everybody knows that he's his favorite by putting this special coat on him? Jacob didn't learn. He did the same thing with his son Joseph. What's wrong with us? That this generational idiocy is continued. Well, I mean, it still happens today, right? Still happens today. There's this sense in which, we can know something is wrong and almost be powerless to avoid doing it. It's almost like there is an innate, inherited problem that we all have. Let's give a name to it. What do you want to call it? Sin. There you go. That's a good 3-letter word. Yeah. That's it. The same thing happening then is the same thing happening now. I mean, we're all born, as Luther put it, and he was just borrowing from Augustine, who was borrowing from Paul, who was borrowing from the Old Testament. We're incurvatus in se. We're curved in on ourselves. And so basically the work of the Spirit throughout our lives is to straighten us up. So instead of being curved in, we're pulled this way. But we're also, as soon as the Spirit like steps away for a second, we're right back, just bounce right back. This happens generationally. This happens in our individual lives as well. But we got favorites here, all right? So this is kind of a setup for what's coming next. So if you look in your 25th chapter to verse 29, we have the first conversation recorded between Jacob and somebody else. It's going to be between Jacob and his brother. So Jacob, verse 29, Jacob had cooked some stew. And Esau came in from the field, and he was very hungry. He was famished. And Esau said to Jacob, "Please let me have a swallow of that red stuff there, for I am famished." I wish I could just read this to you in the Hebrew, because it sounds like Esau can't even talk. It's like he sounds like he's so kind of, I don't know, simple and backwoods that he has trouble even formulating a proper sentence. That's the way the Hebrew communicates this. So that's what he says. He says, give me some of that, the red stuff. I'm hungry. And it says, therefore, his name was called Edom. Edom is just a word for red. So Jacob, first recorded words of Jacob. First recorded words of Jacob. First, sell me your birthright. I told you that already at his nativity, everything you needed to know about Jacob was right there. Well, if that didn't get it, well, then his first recorded speech tells you everything. Jacob, he's so unlikable. He is so unlikable. I think that's why I'm so attracted to him, because there's so much in Jacob that is a mirror of my own soiled soul that I see reflected here in Jacob. First, sell me your birthright. Okay, first recorded words. Esau said, "Well, I'm about to die." He's kind of a drama queen, isn't he? You're not about to die. I mean, you walked into camp, you can speak, you're going to eat, you're going to get up and leave. Really, you're just about to die? So he's exaggerating just a little bit here. So I'm about to die, so what use is my birthright to me? Well, Jacob's not done. He didn't say, "Okay, well, here's your bowl of soup." He's like, no, first swear to me. See, Jacob is also, he might be the first American, he's also the first lawyer that we ever encounter in history. He's going to make sure I'm surprised he didn't pull out some papyrus and say, "Okay, if you'll just sign right here, this little note I've already prepared, this contract that we have." So swear to me. And he swore to him, sold his birthright to Jacob. So Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew. He ate and drank, rose, and went on his way, just no big deal. And thus we're told that Esau despised his birthright. If you don't get mad at me, but I'm going to add a little bit of a line to the Bible here, just verbally. I would add this: thus Esau despised his birthright, and Jacob exploited his brother's misery. Jacob exploited his brother's misery. As often happens in the Bible, you read a story and nobody comes out looking clean. It's like, okay, who's the hero of the story? Nobody. There's nobody who comes out of this story looking like, "Oh, that's the good guy and that's the bad guy." No, both of these guys are acting wrongly for different reasons. Jacob, because he's all about Jacob, is making sure that he gets kind of half of his goal. The first half is to get the birthright. The second half is going to be the blessing of his dad later on. He's going to get the birthright first. He wants to make sure that he's got at least that from his brother. So that's his motivation. Esau's motivation is more base. He's hungry. Hey, listen, we've all been hangry, okay? So don't judge. Esau was kind of hangry this day, I suppose. So that's what he does. So you got brothers who are already demonstrating through their words and through their actions that they're at odds, and one is willing to take advantage of the other and to do whatever it takes to accomplish that. We'll see when we switch over in just a second to chapter 27 that Jacob is going to continue this until he finally gets what he wants. But this right away signals what kind of guy we're working with here. Jacob is willing to take advantage of every situation that he's in for his own benefit, to get what he wants, because he's driven by this desire to achieve, this desire to get, this desire to be top dog. And you probably know this, but I'll say it to make sure that we're all on the same page here. What was the big deal? Well, the big deal was if you're primogenitor, if you're the firstborn, well, then you basically get everything. You get twice the inheritance of anybody else. You become the head of the family. So when Esau came out, a few seconds or whatever, a few minutes before his brother, by that seeming accident of birth, he was set. I mean, everything was going to be handed to Esau. Kind of put yourself in his situation. Your whole life, you've assumed you're good to go. I'm the oldest. I'm going to be dad's replacement. I'm already dad's favorite. So if you're Esau, there's no wondering what you're going to do with your life or wondering if you're going to be successful. You already know. Of course you're going to be successful. I mean, your whole life is just handed to you. You're the firstborn. You're good to go. Nothing to worry about. Now keep that in mind because that's going to explain why Esau reacted the way he did in Genesis chapter 27. And that's why Jacob is so ravenously hungry himself to get this blessing of his father and get this birthright from his brother because he wants to be set. Now let me tell you I'm getting ahead of myself here, but this is a great place to point out an irony. I told you earlier that when I finally got what I wanted, my whole life imploded. It did me no good. Jacob is going to end up getting the blessing of his dad, and what good did it do him? What good did it really do him? He got what he wanted, and then you know what he has to do? Run away for 20 years. During which time, his mom dies. He goes through all of these problems. And when he gets back, as we'll talk about later today, when he gets back and he's confronted with Esau, you know what he calls Esau over and over and over and over? Does he say bro or brother? No, he calls him Lord, 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 Lord. So despite the fact that Jacob went to all this trouble, he really doesn't get any great benefit out of this thing that he fought and lied and blasphemed in order to get. It's a good reminder to us that when we pray, there's something you really want, that's fine. That's great. But when you pray for God to give it to you, say, but your will be done. Because very often what we want out of life is not what God knows is going to be best for us. Now, sometimes God's will and our will actually align. Thanks be to God for, those rare occasions. But very often what you want for yourself is not what God sees as best for you. And so we're disappointed when we don't get what we want. But usually what happens is a few years down the road, we're like, oh, so that's what God was doing. I guess he kind of knows what he's doing after all. He sends us in a different direction. And we discover in this other direction things that we never saw coming. Blessings that were never on the horizon for us. But God knew that he didn't want us going that way. He wanted us going that way because that was the way he could use us in his kingdom. Okay, let's turn the page. We're going to skip chapter 26, not because it's not fun. It is. We get, speaking of like father, like son, we get Isaac lying about his wife. Sister. But that we'll save that for another time. So we're now in chapter 27, and this is the well-known story. I got to look at my time here. We're going to 10:15, right, Tyler? Okay. So this is the well-known story of the whole birthright scene and the blessing of the firstborn and this tremendous deception that mother and son come up with. We're not going to be able to cover all these details, but I do want to work through some of this. So We'll start at the beginning, verse 1 of chapter 27. So Isaac is old. His eyes are too dim to see. He's basically blind, okay? And so he calls his older son Esau and says, my son. And he said, here I am. And Isaac says, look, I know my translation has behold. I always like to translate that as like, look, or hey, or listen up. It's just trying to get your attention. Look, listen up. I'm old, and I don't know the day of my death. So I want you to take your all your hunting stuff, your gear, your quiver, your bow, and go out to the field and hunt some game for me. And then I want you to make this savory dish for me that you know I love, and bring it to me so that I can eat it, so that my soul may bless you before I die. Now, the Bible's full of funny things, and sometimes they're not like obviously funny, but this is one of these funny things because Isaac lives for like, I don't know, over 20 more years. I think Isaac is one of the funniest people in the Bible because he is so clueless about his own life. You ever think about that? First of all, his name, Yitzhak, means laughter. That's how his name, right? Because Sarah laughs, Abraham laughs, because they're, like 190 years old, like they're going to really have a kid. But they do, and so they name him Laughter. And he is kind of a comical figure because he has no clue what's going on most of the time. I mean, even that, I know it's a very serious chapter about when Abraham and Isaac are going up to Mount Moriah where he's going to sacrifice him. But even that has an element of humor because Isaac doesn't even realize he's the sacrifice. Hey, Dad, where's the lamb? Like, you're it, buddy. He doesn't even know what's going on there. We skipped over it, but in the previous chapter, when he gets caught with his wife that he's told everyone is his sister, we're told that Isaac was Isaacing his wife when they were caught. Now, I don't know what that means, but you can probably figure it out. So he gets caught doing this. And then here, he thinks he's going to die. Oh, no, he's going to live like 20 more years. So he's comical because he doesn't really get it. And I love that because that's me most of the time. I don't know what's going on half the time. My wife does, thankfully. She kind of keeps me centered and grounded. But there's so many things in life. I am clueless as to what God is doing in my life. No idea. In fact, most of the time what I think God is doing in my life isn't what he's doing in my life. And this thing over here that is just irritating to me and bothering and troublesome and hurts, that's actually what God is doing. So even in daily situations in my own life, I'm like Isaac. I'm confused. But I don't have to understand God's entire plan for my life. He's got that under control. So here's Isaac thinking he's going to die, saying to Esau, all right, it's time. Death is knocking on the door. Go get me some game. Prepare it. I'm going to bless you. I'm going to give you the blessing of the firstborn. Verse 5, Rebekah was listening. Ooh, you know something's going to happen. She's listening while Isaac spoke to, I love these pronouns, his son Esau. Sometimes it's those little details in biblical text to make you stop and be like, oh, I see what's going on here. Not Rebekah was listening while Isaac spoke to their son Esau. This is just Isaac's son Esau. So when Esau went to the field to hunt for some game to bring home, Rebekah said to her son Jacob, okay, now we're definitely playing favorites. So your son, my son, his son, her son. She said to her son Jacob, look, I heard your father talking to your brother Esau, and here's what he said. Bring me some game, prepare a savory dish for me that I may eat and bless you in the presence of the Lord. She adds that little detail, in the presence of the Lord before my death. Now, therefore, my son, listen to me as I command you. Let me pause there. This is also funny. You know how old Jacob is at this point? In your mind, as you envision this, how old do you picture Jacob? 50? Okay. Anybody else? 40? Yeah. Anybody else? He's like in his mid-70s. Yeah, just like. His mom's like, come here. I heard your dad. He's talking to your brother. And this is what they're going to do. Now, listen. I I want you to do this. Do this, do this, do this. And he's like, yes, yes, Mom, yes, Mom. But what? Shut up. Just do what I say. She's a take charge kind of a lady to her 70-year-old son. Just cracks me up. So listen to what I command you. So go to the flock, bring me 2 choice kids that I can prepare them as a savory dish for your father, such as he loves. And then you're going to bring it to your dad, and he's going to eat it, and he's going to bless you before he dies. Simple plan, right? I ask this every place I speak, and I've gotten different answers. So maybe this will be the situation in which you finally resolve this for me. Does goat meat and deer meat taste the same? This is a big question for me. I'm looking for the definitive answer. I'm hearing no. Did somebody say that it tastes like chicken? Are we really going to go there? Everything tastes like chicken. No one has the definitive answer? You've had both, and they're different. I had a guy in Pennsylvania swear up and down they taste the same. And I thought I had the answer. I thought I did. I go to the next place. I ask the question. I hear several no's. And these are people who had both of these. So it's one of the things I'm going to ask Rebecca in heaven. It's like, all right, what's this recipe where you make goat taste like deer? I need that. So this is the plan. Now, Jacob's listening to this. Okay, all right. Yeah, so I'm going to do this. And then he's like, wait, Mom, but listen, Esau's hairy. And I'm like, I got to shave like once a month, you know. So I'm smooth, he says. Yeah, you're smooth. Yeah, you're real smooth. You said more there than you realized. Verse 12, what if my dad feels me? And this is one of my favorite little phrases of this entire chapter. What if my dad feels me? Then I shall be as a deceiver in his sight. Oh, you think you would? You think maybe? I mean, he might think I'm deceiving him. Yeah, I wonder why. It's strange why he would think that. That's all he's worried about. I'm going to be a deceiver in his sight, and I'm going to bring upon myself a curse and not a blessing. There's no like, Mom, come on, this is wrong. You want me to lie to Dad? Is that ethical? There's no questions of ethics here. This is all a question of, do I get what I want, and is there a way that I can get what I want without getting caught? That's all he's worried about. This is like sinners sinning really, really well, right? I'm going to get what I want, and I'm going to get away with it, scot-free. Who cares whether it's right or wrong? Who cares what I'm doing to my brother? Who cares that I'm lying to my dad? Who cares about God? I just want what I want, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to get there. I just don't want to get caught and suffer the consequences. So Mom says, oh, don't you worry about that at all, my son. Listen, the curse be on me, my son. Only you just obey my voice. So go, get them for me. The Hebrew there is like real blunt. It's like 3 one-syllable words, like go, get, bring. Hurry up, just quit asking questions. We're running out of time. Speaking of which, okay, I got 10 minutes. So he goes and he brings him to his mom, and his mom made this savory dish like his dad loved. And then she goes to the closet. She gets these best garments of Esau, her son. They're all camo. They all smell like the outdoors. And then she puts them on Jacob. And then she puts the skin of the baby goats on his hands and on the smooth part of his neck. Man, it's almost like she had thought this through beforehand. Get the impression like maybe this is the first time she's considered what she might do given the opportunity? She's working fast. You got that sewing machine out. She's in the kitchen. She's sewing, cooking. Man, this woman is a machine. So then she got the savory dish and the bread, and then she gives us all to Jacob. So verse 18. He comes to his father and he says, my father. Well, he's not lying so far. He is his dad. And he said, here am I. Who are you, my son? Now, Isaac might be a comical figure, and he might not know what's going on a lot of the times, but he has a sneaking suspicion there's a skunk in the room. Something not right about this. He didn't say, hi, Esau, glad that you're here. He says, who are you, my son? And Jacob said to his father, I am Esau, your firstborn. I have done as you told me. Get up, please. Sit and eat of my game that you may bless me. Think about the speech of Esau. Speech of Jacob, rather. First of all, we know what he said to his brother, right? And now we've heard what he said to his mother. What if I get caught? And now we hear what he says to his dad. And the first thing he says to his dad is a lie. His first speech to his brother shows how all about Jacob he is. His first speech to his mother shows that all he's concerned about is getting caught. His first recorded speech to his dad is an outright lie, which will soon lead to taking the Lord's name in vain. You know, I like to point this out, and we'll talk about it in our next hour together, but the first time that Jacob has anything good to say is only after God has first spoken to him. It's in the scene where he has the vision, the dream vision of the stairway, and God appears and speaks to him. It's only after that that Jacob has anything good to say, when God has spoken to him. Before that, Jacob is lying. Jacob is all about Jacob. Jacob is only concerned about getting caught. It takes God speaking to us through his words, in other words, to transform our words into something which are good. So Isaac says, how'd you do it so fast, my son? And then Jacob steps over the line. Now, I mean, I'm never going to defend lying, but there's lying and there's damned lying. And I use that word quite precisely, because what he does next is he takes the Lord's name in vain. He lies in God's name. How'd it happen so quickly? Well, Jacob says, well, because the Lord your God caused it to happen to me. Wow. You know, that's the best way to cover up your lie. Just put a veneer of religious truth over the veneer of religion on top of it. You like Jacob yet? So Isaac says to Jacob, well, come here, that I can feel you, my son, whether you are really my son Esau or not. Boy, Isaac his radar is up. So Jacob came close to Isaac, his father. He felt him. He said, well, the voice is the voice of Jacob, but the hands are the hands of Esau. He didn't recognize him because, of course, his hands were hairy like his brother's Esau. And then one more time, are you really my son Esau? Now here's Jacob. There's always a chance. There's always that moment when you can turn back. There's always that moment. Jacob doesn't turn back. He says, I am. So he says, bring it to me. Bring the game that I can bless you. So he brought it. He ate it. He brought the wine. He drank that. And then he came close to kiss Isaac. And then Isaac also smelled the garments and he pronounced the blessing upon him. So the one sense that Jacob could not cover up was hearing. He had everything else covered. Everything else was taken care of. But he couldn't conceal that. But even that did not present an insurmountable obstacle to him getting what he wanted from his dad. And here's the thing about this. It worked. The lies, the taking the Lord's name in vain, all of this worked. The wife, the mother, orchestrating this whole thing, everything she orchestrated worked. Isaac pronounced the blessing, and the thing about the biblical blessings is you can't unbless someone. Once the words are spoken, they're spoken. I now pronounce you man and wife. You can't turn around the very next minute and say, I unpronounce you man and wife. No, the words are spoken, right? They've created the reality. So that's what the blessing does here. It creates the reality of the blessing. And so in the end, it will be, in fact, the older that serves the younger. That will be the long-term result of all of this. God's will be done. That he spoke to the mom all these decades before. In the midst of this jealousy and lies and taking the Lord's name in vain and ambition and all of this ugly family drama that's going on here, God's will is done. And I love that. Because it means, it doesn't matter if you're an individual or a couple or a family or a church. You don't have to finally get to the point of having everything finally figured out and your life on track and all of your problems solved and, be living the ideal Christian life. You don't have to kind of get to that point before God's finally going to be like, oh, yeah, finally those people got their act together. I can do something with them. It's not like that at all. God was able to work through this mess of a family for his will to be done. God is able to work through the mess of your life to get his will done. God's able to work through the mess of your marriage to get his will done. He's able to work through the dysfunction of your family to get his will done. Because God's will being done is not contingent upon your obedience. It's not like God is waiting for you to do something so he can finally react. He's not waiting for you to finally become, some spiritual giant before he can actually use you. He's going to use you where you're at. He's going to use you in your weakness. He's going to use you even in your sin. In fact, you might even say mostly in your sin is where God is going to use you. Because he's going to use your sin to open up your eyes to your own depravity and your weakness. I mean, some of the most epiphany moments in your life is when you screw up big time. And in the aftermath of that, the Spirit opens your eyes to see that you created this situation and you can't fix it. But God can step in and pronounce forgiveness and healing and peace and take up these pieces and glue them back together and use you as a vessel for his own glory and his own good. He does this with Jacob and Esau and Isaac and Rebekah. He does this in our lives, and we know the reason that he does it in our lives, and we know the reason he did it here is because in the climactic moment of God's doing good for humanity, in that moment where God did the greatest good of all time for all people, your eyes, if you would have seen it, would have said, this is a total mess, a failure, a travesty of justice. Of course, I'm talking about the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ. The worst thing that ever happened, that is simultaneously the best thing that ever happened. We killed God. Worst thing that we could have ever done. Son of God, God himself, willingly let himself be killed in order that from that death, he might give us life and forgiveness. From the mess that we created, he was able to craft your salvation, your eternal destiny out of the worst event in human history. Now, if God is able to do that through the cross, he's able to do this through these biblical families. And God is able to do that in your own life as well. Because God's never met an individual or a couple or a family or a congregation that he can't use in great and good ways for the people involved as well as for others. Because God ultimately is not a God who is a tit for tat, quid pro quo, you scratch my back, I scratch yours, transactional deity. Thank God he's not. He's the kind of God who looks at all of us and says, those folks are weak and powerless and have a lot of problems, and I love them. In fact, I even like them. And because of that, in our lives, as individuals, couples, families, congregations, God is at work to bring good, to do good, and always, always to love us and to keep us close to him. He did it for this family. He does it for our families as well. All right, we are at 10:15. So I'm going to have Tyler come up and give some brief instructions to y'all, and then we'll be back in a few minutes. You guys actually did what Tyler said. That's impressive. This is the most obedient congregation I've been in a long time. Okay, so we're going to touch on a couple things that were still left over here in Genesis 28, but our main focus is going to be talking about what happens next in Jacob's life, really the next, you call, phase of or season of Jacob's life. So, of course, after Jacob gets the blessing, steals the blessing from his father, then Esau is not going to simply shrug this off, right? I told you earlier how Esau was set. I mean, his whole future was before him. Everything was falling into place for him. So imagine that you're, well, I said they're in their 70s, but imagine you're kind of in your midlife. Which is kind of where they're at. So you're, I don't know, in your mid-30s, let's say, and everything is laid out for you. I mean, everything's going to be handed to you. You know exactly what's going to happen. Your future is bright. It's great. There's nothing to worry about. And then all of a sudden, due to whatever happens, let's say due to the evil of a particular individual, your entire future is stolen from you. Well, how are you going to react? Probably not like Job. You're not going to say, oh, the Lord gave and the Lord is taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. It'd probably be like either, where's my gun? I'm going to call my lawyer. Or at least, where's his face and where's my fist, right? You're going to be extremely upset, maybe even murderously angry over this. It's not a right reaction, but it's certainly an understandable reaction. And that's a reaction that Esau has. Where's my brother? I'm going to kill him. Well, of course, word gets back to mom and dad, and so they figure out, well, we got to do something. We got to go to Jacob for a while until Esau kind of cools off. So mom comes up with a plan. She's like, well, you know what? He's not married yet. We got to get that boy a wife. I know where I should send him, to a family reunion. That's where. We sometimes read these narratives, and here's part of our problem. We think reading the Bible needs to be a very serious, a deeply spiritual experience. And it certainly can be, but the Bible's also a very funny story. And so you can laugh. There's so many things that are very, very funny. And so one of the things that we kind of read over sometimes, yes, Jacob is going to go and he's going to find a wife in Haran from his mother's relatives. Yeah, do you realize how weird that is? And it's not just like here. It happens all over the place. So a biblical wife is related to you, pretty much. That's kind of the way this goes. Now, I will say this, and I don't want to get too far afield, but this is actually not that uncommon. So we are the weird ones. We are the weird ones. There's a book, actually, I can't think of, The Weirdest People in the World, and weird is an acronym for Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic, which describes a very small portion of the world, and we're part of that small, weird portion of the world. And part of our weirdness is that we think it's strange if cousins marry cousins. But that was practiced throughout world history, and it's still practiced in many cultures today. You marry within the broader range of your family. And that happened, of course, in biblical times as well. This is one of these occasions where you kind of got to step back and realize how culturally distanced you are from some of these things. You realize, okay, it's very strange to me, and I wouldn't recommend it. But it's not weird or strange to people back then. In fact, back then, it's just kind of the common thing that you do. So he's going to go to his family. He's going to find a wife. And one of the things I like to point out is that mom says, stay for a while. A few days is actually what she says. Stay for a few days, and then I'll send you word when your brother has cooled off. Well, a few days turn into 20 years. 20 years. With the result so Rebecca really wanted this to happen. Well, this is another one of these occasions where what she not only wanted to happen, but orchestrated to happen through deception ends up rebounding and not in a good way, because she never, ever sees her son again. She's dead by the time that Jacob gets back. So she says bye, not realizing that's the last thing that she will say to her son. Another thing about this is that during the 20 years, Jacob probably thought eventually that he would receive word from his mom, right? Saying, hey, Esau's cooled off, he's fine now, come home. But the email never came. Nothing. So this partly explains why when he does return after 20 years, who's he afraid of? Esau. In his head, Esau is just as mad as he was 20 years ago because mom never sent him any kind of message to say, it's all right. Esau has finally let his fury subside. So a couple of details I think that are worth mentioning there. So Jacob is about to embark on the second phase of his life. I mentioned he was in his mid-70s when he leaves, when all this is happening. So now he's going to enter into the phase that I like to refer to as his exile. Any one of you experienced exile? Unless you're like very young in the room, and it's very bright in here, so I can't see a lot of ages, but unless you're very young, if you have not experienced exile, I would be very shocked. Because exiles occur in all sorts of different ways. There can be a literal exile, like refugees today experience exile. They're uprooted from that which they know, from their home, and they're forced into other circumstances. They're in exile. And sometimes they go back, sometimes they never go back. There's that kind of physical relocation kind of exile. But there's a multitude of other kinds of exiles. There's the exile of divorce. There's the exile of death, where you're grieving. There's the exile, it's kind of an emotional exile. There's exiles that take place at work. What I mean by that is there are situations in life that confront every single one of us, usually multiple times, where we are uprooted from that which is stable and secure, which we know everything is okay, and all of a sudden our lives are in the midst of chaos and uncertainty and confusion, and we don't know what's going to happen to us next. And typically in those occasions we are plagued by fear, some of which are legitimate, many of which are not legitimate or irrational, but it doesn't matter because fear is fear. And when you're in that situation of exile, very often that's when God is able to step in and to do with you what he would not be able to do in other situations. Because in other situations, you think that you've got it all together. I mean, that's the way we are. I mean, when everything is going well in life, on those like rare occasions when it does, typically what we are doing spiritually is thinking, man, I've got my act together, everything is going great, and we forget that the only reason that things are going great is because God in his goodness has created this to happen for us. And it's not our own doing, it's all the doing of God. And so usually in those times, we rather than giving thanks to God for doing what he did in our lives, we tend to think that we've accomplished this. And so we get kind of full of ourselves. We get a self-certainty rather than a God certainty. And exiles then open our eyes to the fact that, oh, you thought that you had everything together. You never had everything together. This was all God's gift. You thought that you were finally able to break free from that addiction and you're doing well. It wasn't you. That was God. You thought that, whatever at work is going great was all because of your hard work and your know-how. This was all a gift from God. I'm not saying that he wasn't working through you, but everything that we have is a gift. The fact that you're sitting here right now and your heart is beating and your lungs are breathing and you can feel, this is all the gift of God. If God stopped speaking us into existence for one moment, it would all be gone. Everything we have is pure grace. Even our own existence is. And so sometimes we need to go into exile in order that there God might be able to do with us what he is more challenged to do in ordinary circumstances because, again, there's more of me in me, and so there's less room for God in me. So Jacob needs to go into exile. He needs to go into this time of uncertainty and chaos and fear, because it's there that God is going to be able to actually work in his life. Now, exile can take many different forms. I went into exile through my own doing, my mid-30s, for many, many dark years, in which I was in this land of exile. Still going through the exile of grief. I think most of you know that we lost our son a little over 2 years ago. So we're still going through that exile of grief. And I was talking with Tyler before we started today, and it comes and it goes. Last week was terrible. Today I'm fine. Next week, who knows? But that's life in exile. It's uncertainty. You don't know what's gonna come next. So with Jacob, he didn't know what was going to come next. In fact, we're told that when he left, you know what he left with? A stick. We're told, in his own words, he said, 20 years ago I left with the staff in my hand. That's all. That's all he had. And he comes back, of course, with a lot, which we'll get there. But that's all he leaves with a stick. That's all he has. He doesn't know what's coming next. All he knows, he's got a long journey ahead. He's got to go live with his mom's relatives and hopefully get a wife there, but he doesn't know. I mean, think of all the days he's alone traveling. That's a long journey from where he lives all the way to Haran. He's got to make that journey alone. Now, one great thing happens, though, right away, and this is what I want to talk about here for a minute. If you'll turn to chapter 28, a wonderful thing happens along the way to where, to steal a phrase from somebody else, Jacob not only has a staff in his hand, but he has a word in his pocket. He's got a word of God in his pocket, and we'll hear what that word is in just a minute. So we're going to go to Genesis 28, verse 10. So Jacob departed from Beersheba and went toward Haran, and he came to a certain place and spent the night there because the sun had set, and he took one of the stones of the place and put it by or under his head. You could translate that either way. And he lay down in that place. I'm going to stop here for just a second. Notice that verse 11 says he came to, my translation has a certain place. Anyone have something different? Particular place. Now in Hebrew, it's real simple. It says he came to Hamakom, which means the place. I love the details in the Bible. It doesn't say he came to a place. This is not a place. This is the place. Jacob didn't know he came to the place. Jacob thought he came to a place. This is just another place to Jacob. But to God, it's not another place. It's the place. I point this out because that defines our lives. How many conversations have you had over the course of your life where you thought it was a conversation and it turns out to be the conversation? How many people have you met in the course of your life and you thought it was just a meeting and it turns out to be the meeting? Maybe you're married to the one that you thought was just a meeting and now you realize it was the meeting. How many of these situations in life do we encounter where we think it's just one more thing happening, one more person we're meeting, one more encounter that we're having, and God's like, no, this is capital T, the place. It's a beautiful reminder to me that I'm not in charge of my own life. I'm doing the best I can. I'm putting one foot in front of the other. I'm getting up every morning. I'm doing my job. I'm loving my neighbor. I'm doing everything that I can to live a faithful life, messing up plenty along the way. But I know that I'm not the one who's in charge of my life. God is. He's directing my steps, and he's going to direct them sometimes to a place, and sometimes he's going to direct them to the place. And in that place, he's going to do for me what I never dreamed of him doing before. I have to tell this story. It's just a real short story. Go back to 2014. I'm checking my Facebook, and I got a message from some guy named Daniel Emery Price. I don't know who this is. No clue. And it's real short. He's like, hey, love to talk sometime. I think you and I have some things in common. Like to run some ideas by you. And my first thought was, no. I don't know this guy. I'm not going to talk to him. No clue who this is. But I decided, okay, all right, I'll make an exception. I'll talk to him. Well, that night, Daniel Emery Price called, a stranger to me, and we ended up talking for like 2 or 3 hours. And that was, for me, Hamakom. That was the place. Because Daniel Emery Price ended up connecting me with the work he was doing with what was called Christ Hold Fast back then. And we started this podcast called 40 Minutes in the Old Testament. Maybe some of you have heard of it. 10 years ago. And then the work that we did got connected with the organization called 1517. And eventually I was hired full-time by them to be doing what I do now. And it all started when I opened up my Facebook one time and there was not a message, but the message. You just never know what God has in store for you. So this is Jacob. He thinks he's just camping out here. He's got a rock either under his head as a pillow or by his head. The Hebrew can be translated either way. And that night, he had a dream, verse 12. I always think that the reason that God waited to this moment to do something for Jacob is he waited to where Jacob could not say anything. This is not a road to Damascus kind of thing where Jesus speaks to Jacob as he's walking along. Jacob, Jacob, because Jacob is awake. He could have done his Jacob thing. God waits till he's asleep. Okay, he can't say anything. This is the perfect opportunity. So he's asleep. He has a dream. And there is it can be translated two different ways. It's sulam in Hebrew, which can be translated either as a stairway, like a ramp or a stairway, or a ladder. I'm guessing it's a stairway because if it's a ladder and you have angels going up and down, that breaks all kinds of OSHA rules. Just can't let this happen. So this is probably like a stairway, all right? You got angels going up and you got angels going down. And the top of this stairway reaches up into heaven. Awesome dream. My dreams are all just random weird stuff. This is actually a good dream. Verse 13 says, behold, look, wow, the Lord stood, and then we have a prepositional phrase here that can be translated a couple different ways. I'm guessing all of your English translations translated as above it. Anyone have something different there? The Lord stood above it? Oh, really? What translation do you have? Beautiful. I did not know the New Revised Standard Version did that. So evidently New Revised Standard Version and the Jewish publication, the Jewish translation, the JPS Tanakh, has beside him. So the prepositional phrase in Hebrew is alav, which can be translated both of those ways, both completely accurate. Above it, that is above the stairway, or beside him. Now I think beside him is right. Because, number one, it's theologically more in tune with the whole way that God works. He doesn't stand up in heaven and boom down to Jacob. He actually gets down to where he is. He's a boots on the ground kind of God. And secondly, when Jacob wakes up in a few minutes, he's going to say, God is in this place and I didn't know it. He's like, there, in that place. So I'm going to go with beside him. So the Lord stood beside him and said, now are you ready for the speech? Man, I'm ready for this speech. I cannot wait for God to just lay into Jacob. I mean, I have been itching for this moment. This jerk has lied, has deceived, has stabbed his brother in the back, has taken the Lord's name in vain. He's got it coming. I mean, I can't wait for God to just let him have it. This is going to be a come to Jesus kind of moment. So listen with me at this heavy hitting law that God is going to lay on Jacob. Y'all ready? Okay, get him, God. Here we go. I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. Okay, that's a pretty good start. What do we got next? The land on which you lie, I will give it to you and to your descendants. What's giving? Your descendants shall also be like the dust of the earth. And you shall spread out to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. And in you and in your seed shall all the families of the earth be blessed. And behold, I'm with you, and will keep you wherever you go, and I'm going to bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. Period. End of quotation. That's disappointing. I don't know about you, and you're probably different than me, but when I see somebody doing something wrong, I'm thinking, man, I can't wait till they get what they have coming. They're cruising for divine bruising, and they're going to get it. God is going to give them exactly what they have coming. Now, you're probably not like me in this respect either, but when I've messed up, I'm like, I hope God is gracious and merciful, forgiving, and all that good stuff to me. Isn't that the way we operate? I mean, somebody angers me, like on the road or whatever. Like, man, I hope there's a cop waiting up there, going to pull you over and give you a big fat ticket. Now, when I'm speeding, I'm like, man, I hope I see him before he sees me. Right? This is the way it works in life. We want people who are doing wrong to get caught and punished, but when we're doing wrong, we want to be absolved and forgiven. That's the way it works. Now, Jacob here, now, had God kind of laid into him, would he have deserved it? Absolutely, for sure. I mean, not a good guy, done some bad things. He deserved getting slapped around a little bit. There's no slapping going on here at all. Instead, God just steps right up and says, I'm God, and I'm going to do all these great things for you. And that's very frustrating for me as a sinner who wants to see another sinner get what they have coming. But this, I think, is one of these revelatory moments in the Old Testament where the true heart of God is revealed. Where you have a sinner here who deserves the worst, and he gets the best. He deserves to have a curse, punishment, at least a stern preaching of the law laid upon him, at a minimum, and he gets none of it. Instead, God steps up and looks at this guy and says, I'm going to do good things for you. Now, does that not reveal exactly who God is? Not just in the Old Testament, but still today. There's a verse in the Bible that says something like, while we were still sinners, while we, in fact, not just that, but we were enemies of God. While we were enemies, while we were sinners, while we were dead in our trespasses, while we were rebellious, while we were by nature children of wrath, while all this was true, God showed up and said, I'm going to do the best thing for you. I'm going to live the life that you cannot and have not lived. I'm going to die the death that you cannot ever die. And I'm going to rise from the grave that you can never rise from on your own. And I'm going to do it all, not because you deserve it, not because you somehow merited my attention and my work. I'm going to do it all because of who I am. And that, friends, is crucial. Our confidence is never interior. It's always exterior. Our confidence in the fact that we are good with God is never because we are good in ourselves, even though we tend to think that way. If you get nervous about the afterlife, or you get nervous about where you stand with God, the immediate thing we tend to do is to look inside. Well, I don't know, is my heart right toward God? Have I done this? Have I done that? Am I leading the kind of exemplary life that I should lead? Do I have enough faith? Do I have enough love? Do I have enough hope? Enough of all of this you stuff. Our confidence is not based upon anything within us or anything that we've done. It's all exterior, external. It's all wrapped up in the heart of God. It's all wrapped up in the person and work of Jesus Christ. He is your confidence. So if you don't want to know whether you're right with God, it's just simply look at Jesus on the cross. Look at Jesus raised from the dead. There's your confidence. It's all in Him. None of it's in us. Because the goodness and grace and mercy and the forgiveness of God is incarnate there in Jesus Christ. And I'll add this. We got to say this. Because I believe fully, unreservedly, that the Lord who appeared to Jacob and said these good and gracious and undeserved words is none other than the Son of the Father. So we see this throughout the Old Testament where God will show up in a variety of ways. He sometimes shows up as a messenger, as he did to Hagar, as he does to Moses at the burning bush. He sometimes shows up as a man, as he did to Abraham and to Sarah, when he shows up and says, you're going to have a baby next year. A man that had a meal with him. Sometimes he shows up, as we'll see this afternoon, as a wrestler who's going to get down and dirty with Jacob in the mud of the Jabbok River. Sometimes he shows up in other ways. And he is sent by God, but when he shows up, he's called God. He's worshiped as God. He calls himself God. Well, who is this God who's sent by God, but is God? Well, it's the Son of the Father. So I believe what John says in chapter 1, verse 18 applies throughout the Scriptures. John says in chapter 1, verse 18, no one has seen God at any time. No one. But the only begotten God, who's in the bosom of the Father, has made him known. No one has seen God, but the only begotten God, he's been seen. He's been known. He's revealed himself. And he's revealed himself not just in his incarnation, but he's revealed himself from Genesis 1 onward. Who was walking with Adam and Eve in the cool of the day? Jesus. Who wrestled with Jacob? Jesus. Who appeared in the burning bush? Jesus. He is the one who is the revelation of the Father, always, in the Old Testament, New Testament to us. So, in a beautiful way, the one who now stands beside Jacob and speaks these words of grace and promise is none other than the one who shows up eventually as the son of Mary to speak words of grace and promise. To say to the likes of you and me, come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. I'll be with you. I'll protect you. I'll guard you and keep you. I am your good and gracious God. What he said to Jacob is what he says to us till today. So isn't it beautiful that it's not like eventually the heart of Jesus was changed toward people? The heart of Jesus has always been what it always is toward us: soft, gracious, and forgiving. So Jacob does not get what he has coming. He gets instead divine mercy, just like we don't get what we have coming. Thanks be to God. Instead, we get mercy and grace. Now, here's a cool thing, too. Now, if you listen to my podcast or the other material, you know one thing that I love to do is to demonstrate how the Old Testament and the New Testament are not two different Bibles who happen to be glued together. They're not two different stories that happen to be in the same book. They're one story, one continuous salvation story. And so what you see happening in the Old Testament very often has its parallel in the New Testament. Well, here's a great parallel for you. What we just read about here, turn to the very end of John chapter 1, and you have Jesus having this conversation with his disciples. And he says to one of them, "Oh, you're impressed that I saw you while you were under the tree? Oh, you ain't seen nothing yet. That was nothing. You will see the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man." Now, you don't have to be a scholar of the Old Testament to hear the echo of what's happening here in Genesis, right? You're not going to see the angels of God ascending and descending on some stairway. You're going to see ascending and descending on me, because I am the bridge between heaven and earth. I am fully God and fully man, so of course I'm the perfect mediator between God and humanity. So Jesus, at the end of John 1, is affirming that this story is actually about him. Of course. He's the one who is there to begin with. He's the one who's standing beside Jacob, speaking these words, and then ultimately he's the one who takes the place of that stairway, because he's the one upon whom the angels of God ascend and descend. He joins heaven and earth. And just one more thing here before we leave the story and go into the whole marriage issues with Jacob. I think this is maybe too simplistic, but I think there's basically two different approaches to Christianity. There's a stairway climbing Christianity where we kind of work our way up to God. And this can happen in different sorts of ways. This can happen through, here's your 10 spiritual steps that you need to follow to get yourself to where God wants you to be. Step 1, step 2, step 3, you just climb that ladder of spiritual success, and pretty soon you're right where God wants you to be, and you did it. You did it. God helped you a little bit, but you did it. There's that. Or there's also kind of the mystical version of Christianity where you go through these mystical exercises, and you kind of climb the steps until you have this vision of God. Now, whether it's a kind of a legalism or a good works, or whether it's a mysticism, it's all the same thing. You're working your way up to God. You're getting to where he is. That's one version of Christianity. The other version of Christianity is radically different. God steps down to you. He comes to you. You don't go to him. He comes to where you are. He stands there with you. In fact, as one of you. The God who's also one of us. He's there with us to be on the ground with us, to be present with us, to hunt us down, to search us out, to hound us if that's what it takes, to make sure that we are where he wants us to be. It's not up to us to make some sort of progress and finally work our way up to God. Rather, he works his way down to where we are. And that's what grace and mercy looks like. So Jacob's going to leave this place with this word of God in his pocket. It's a pretty awesome word. I'll be with you. I'm going to bless you. In fact, this is the language he gave to Abraham. You're going to be, in your seed, all the families of the earth will be blessed. That's Genesis 12 language. That's what God said to Abraham. Now the blessing has gone from Abraham to laughter, to Mr. Isaac, now to Mr. Heel, to Jacob. God is a weird God. He does not work the way that we work. He doesn't look for the people who are, the most qualified or the people who are the spiritual giants. He just picks ordinary folks, sometimes unlikable folks like Jacob. All right, so Jacob is ready to go. So he's going to head into exile. Y'all ready? Okay, here we go. We're gonna work our way now from where he's at all the way up kind of the Fertile Crescent. We're going to work our way around to Haran. And when he gets there, it's a long trip. When he gets there, Jacob's a little emotional. We get to see a little bit different side of Jacob. So if you pick up the story with chapter 29, it skips his whole journey for the most part. He gets there, and he finds a well, and there's some flocks of sheep by it, and there's some lazy shepherds sitting around it, just kind of lolling around. And he strikes up a conversation with them and says basically, hey, where are you guys from? And they say, oh, we're from Haran. And Jacob says to them, verse 5, do you know Laban, the son of Nahor? And they say, yeah, everybody knows Laban. Everybody would know Laban too. Laban, whatever you like to picture in your mind is kind of a greasy, sneaky, watch your wallet when he's around you kind of guy who would put his arm around you and really chat you up while he's stealing your money. Whatever image you have, what he looks like, that's Laban. That's Laban. His name in Hebrew means white, but I've always thought it should have been green because he's all about the green stuff. This is Laban. So anyway, do you know Laban? And they say, yeah, we know him. And he says, well, is he okay? Is everything fine with him? They say, yeah, he's good. And look, there's Rachel, his daughter, coming with the sheep. Just so happened. I mean, just a coincidence, right? Lo and behold, here's Rachel coming with the sheep. And he says, oh, it's like noon. It's not time to water the livestock. It's still high day. It's not time for the livestock to be gathered. Water the sheep and go pasture them. And they say, well, we can't do this. Somebody has to roll the stone away from the mouth of the well before we do this. So verse 9 says, while he's talking, then Rachel came with her father's sheep. Now, guys, what do we do to try to impress women? It's not impressive at all to them, but we are going to go with the lie that it is impressive with them. It's one of the things we do to impress women. Show them how strong we are. Obviously, their hearts melt when they see us demonstrators. Right? Isn't that right, ladies? Yeah, sure. Y'all just go ahead and believe whatever you want to believe. So this is his chance. This is Jacob. He's going to show how strong he is. And so he goes up to the mouth of that well, and he rolls that stone away, showing what a strong guy he is. And not only that, but listen to this. Verse 11. Jacob the romantic. Jacob kissed Rachel, and then he lifted his voice and wept. I don't know if there's any young guys in the room, but if there are, don't do this. It's not a good look. And I don't know if Jacob didn't have a lot of dating experience, but kissing a girl and then crying afterward. I can't believe they ended up together, but maybe Rachel was a very forgiving soul, but this is not dating advice, right? But, laying aside the humor, isn't it kind of cool, though, that Jacob demonstrates a different side? Everything we've seen about Jacob so far is very unlikable. But now, he breaks down. It's a different side to him. See, people aren't one-sided. They're not flat personality. There's not a single person here or in existence, as far as that goes, who has a very flat personality. There's always depth. Now, sometimes it's hard to get there with certain people, but there's always depth. There's always multiple sides to people, and we're meeting a different side of Jacob here. He wept. I think he was probably partly relieved after all that time, all those days on the road. And not only does he find out that he's made it and these guys know Laban, but here's Rachel, and Rachel is hot. She's good looking. So he kisses her, and then he just kind of breaks down emotionally. He tells her who he is. She's probably thinking, who is this weirdo? Just random dude comes up and kisses me and then cries. He says, well, let me explain. I'm a relative of your dad. I'm Rebekah's son. So she goes and ran, tells her father, and now Laban comes out. So Laban heard news of Jacob, his sister's son. He runs to meet him, embraced him, kissed him, and brought him to his house. So he's made it, all right? This is the beginning of the 20 years. Now, what's going to happen here over the course of these 20 years? Well, we're going to hear what's going to happen right away as the narrative progresses. I'm just going to summarize it for you. So you kind of picture they're spend a few days, they're talking, they get, catching up on the news. This is before Facebook, so you can't stalk one another's accounts to see what they're doing. So he's kind of filling me in. Yeah, this has been happening at home. I'm sure he edited the details. Yeah, I stole my brother's, blessing. He wanted to kill me, so I thought I'd hang out with you guys for a few days. I'm sure he edited that out. But, they're talking, and after a while, Laban's like, well, you're not going to work for me for free, so what do you want to get paid? Well, let me tell you what he wants to get paid. Verse 16 tells us Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the older was Leah, however you want to say her name. And the name of the younger, that we've already met here, was Rachel. Now, Leah's eyes were rock. That's the Hebrew that's used there, which your translations might translate as weak. I don't like that translation. I think it's better tender, soft. She had good eyes. I don't know that she had anything else going for her, but she had good eyes. Rachel was everything. She was beautiful of form and face, which, of course, today we would say she was beautiful or hot or however you want to say it. She had everything, all right? Head down, got the pretty face, got the pretty body. She's got the looks. And no surprise, Jacob loved Rachel. So when it came to discussing wages, he's like, well, I'll tell you what. I'll work 7 years if I can marry Rachel. Laban's probably thinking, you idiot, I'd have given it to you for 3 years. Anyway, 7 years they agree on. So 7 years. So that's what they're going to do. I'll serve you 7 years for your younger daughter Rachel. And Laban said, well, it's better I give her to you than somebody else. So verse 20 tells us that Jacob served 7 years for Rachel. Okay, I need a big and they seemed to him but a few days because of his love for her. Oh, that's so sweet. But it is a different side of Jacob, though, right? I mean, you can know a guy, and you think you know a guy, and then he falls in love, and you're like, who are you? What is wrong with you? This is not the person I've known for the last 25 years. Yeah, but I'm into this girl, and yeah, everything changes, right? So you see a different side of Jacob. So 7 years he labors. And he's probably counting them off, And finally, 7 years have passed. Thank goodness. He goes to Laban, says, all right, let's get the wedding. I'm ready. So Laban gathers all the men of the place. They make a feast. Now, the word for feast in Hebrew is related to the verb for drink. It's kind of like our word symposium, which literally means a drinking feast. It's kind of funny. I'm going to go to Fort Wayne or St. Louis for the drinking feast, symposium. So you got a feast here, which is also not just food, but also drink. It partly explains what happens next, of course. Now, verse 23 says that it came about in the evening. Okay, we're picturing dark. This is before we have artificial lighting, right? All the lights are off. That he took his daughter Leah and brought her to him. And Jacob, in the blunt language of the Bible, went into her. Come on, he didn't realize this was Leah? I'll give the guy a break, okay? He's been waiting 7 years. I think he was probably, number one, partly or fully intoxicated. Number two, it was dark. And number three, he was in a hurry. I'm guessing. I don't know. He was focusing on other things. Let's put it that way. So Jacob goes into her. Verse 24, Laban also gave his maid Zilpah to daughter Leah as a maid. She's going to come up later in the narrative. And this is, verse 25 might be my favorite verse in the whole book of Genesis. So it came about in the morning. The economy of language is just so beautiful here. It came about in the morning. Behold, it was Leah. 4 words. Real simple. Now, I would spend like a page describing this in my writing. Me looking up a thesaurus, words I can use here, painting the whole scene. The Bible can do that in a much better way in 4 words, because you see it all, don't you? Behold, it was Leah. Surprise. So he does what hopefully none of you did on the morning after your wedding night. He goes to his father-in-law and says, "What is this you have done to me?" Was it not for Rachel that I served with you? Why have you, don't you hate it when that happens? Wow, man, why have you deceived me? Ooh, that hurts. What goes around comes around. In fact, this isn't the last time that Jacob is going to be deceived. His own sons are going to deceive him much later when they send a coat of many colors that's now the coat of one color, red, blood. And they're going to deceive their father, Jacob, into thinking that Joseph has been killed. So the deceiver is deceived. So Laban, you got to give it to Laban. I mean, this guy he's slick. He pretends that he is shocked that Jacob didn't realize this is the way this works. You didn't know? They don't do this in your country? I mean, here, we obviously, we're going to give you the younger first. You need to take Culture 101. This is not the way this works. No, obviously, we give the older first. But if you want the younger, for 7 more years, be happy to give her to you as a wife. So he's completely unfazed by this, as if, you didn't know this was going to go on? So he proposes this, and Jacob, what's Jacob going to do? Going to say, okay, I guess I'll just be happy with Leah. Well, no, he loves Rachel. And so he says, all right, I'll do it. And so they wait a week. And so he might be the only person in history who's had a wedding and then a week later have another wedding. But that's what they do. Marries one sister, marries another sister. Now he has sister wives. So don't think that he had to wait 7 more years, in other words. He got Rachel right away. And then he has to work 7 more years. So it's going to be 14 years for his two wives. And then she gets a maidservant as well. So this begins, needless to say, issues within Jacob's family. Just think about this whole scenario. Just step back from it for a minute. Laban, who we've already realized is a smooth talker. He's real greasy. He's now not only uncle, but he's also father-in-law and boss. And Laban is also, I would argue, in the bigger narrative, Laban is also the Pharaoh figure here. He's the one who oppresses the people of God. He's the one who tricks and deceives and manipulates and takes from the people of God. So Laban is a Pharaoh character before we even meet Pharaoh in the book of Exodus. So he's that, all rolled into one. You got that. You got Jacob working for him. And then you also have Jacob now married to 2 sisters. That apply to any of you guys? No? Okay, that's good. Glad we're keeping polygamy out of the congregation here. It's always a good thing. But you got 2 sisters, and I don't need to tell either you men or especially you ladies that there's going to be some problems. Right? I mean, show of hands. Any of you ladies be happy if your husband also married your sister? I'm looking. Hand, no hands. Yeah. I don't care how much you love your sister, you don't want your sister loving your husband, right? Listen. Them's fighting words, right? So you know there's going to be problems. And it doesn't take long to realize the problems surface right away. So what happens? Who begins having babies? Leah. So the one who's not loved ends up having the sons. And the one who is loved, Rachel, doesn't have any sons, right? So what are you going to do? What are your options? Well, we got a couple of options. They're called maidservants. One belongs to Rachel and one belongs to Leah. And what they could do back then, and it was completely legal. In fact, we see this already happening in the book of Genesis early on in chapter 16, where you have Hagar. Hagar is the maidservant of Sarah, and Sarah says, well, I can't get pregnant. She says, actually, the Lord has prevented me from getting pregnant. So why don't you go into my Egyptian maidservant, Hagar? So they were already doing this back then. So we're going to do this here as well. So the 2 sister wives who are in this baby-making competition, they're going to enlist the help of their surrogates as well. And as we read on, both of them will begin to have kids. When did Jacob work? That's what I want to know. He's a busy guy. I mean, he's fathering children with 3 women. He's trying to father children with a 4th woman. So he's got all this, and then babies are starting to be born in this competition. And look at the names. Now, this is a depressing part of the story. Very depressing part of the story. So this is the end of chapter 29. So Leah conceived, bore a son, and named him Reuben, because she said, because the Lord has seen my affliction, surely now my husband will love me. Very sad. So Reuben is from the verb to see. So she names him, the Lord has seen. The Lord has seen, and now, I've given him a son. Now, Jacob will love me. Does it work that way? No, it doesn't. You're not going to purchase somebody's love. It doesn't happen that way. But that's what she's trying to do. I feel for her. And she's not over, because she conceived again. She bore a second son. And she said, because the Lord has not only seen now, but he's heard that I am unloved. He's therefore given me this son also. So she named him Simeon, from the word for hear. So we got a seeing, we got a hearing, but she's not done yet. She conceived and bore another son, and this time she said, now my husband will love me, because I'm become attached to me, lavah in Hebrew, because I have borne him 3 sons. And so she named him Levi, which means attached. 1, 2, 3. Did it work? No, it didn't. I will add this too, just because she was unloved did not mean that she was not also, that her bed was also not frequented by Jacob. He was still going to her bed. Obviously, still having kids together. Now, I don't know what happened in Leah's life. Maybe 3rd time's a charm kind of deal. You know, she had named 3 sons, all these negative names. And by the way, how would you like to have that name attached to you, given this background? Yeah. Mom, why'd you name me Reuben? Well, I found it in a baby book. I just kind of liked the way it sounded. So she got 3 sons. And she does something different with the 4th. Verse 35 says, she conceived again and bore a son and said, this time I will praise the Lord. And therefore she named him Judah. And then she stopped bearing. 1, 2, 3, all designed basically to get her husband's love. And then finally, again, I wish I knew more. And maybe one of these days I'll ask her, what was it that happened that caused you to change the very tone of your sons' names? Whatever it was a good change. She names him Praise. He's the praise son. And we know in the bigger picture of Scripture just how momentous this is. Because as the narrative progresses, we hear that the firstborn, Reuben, makes a big mistake. Big moral mistake. He sleeps with one of his dad's co-wives, one of the maidservants, commits incest. Whatever that incestuous union would be called, I don't know. This whole situation is so screwed up that I don't even have a name for it. But anyway, he sleeps with her, and Dad finds out. So when you go to Genesis 49, when Jacob is giving a blessing over each of the tribes, he references that, and Reuben does not get the blessing, even though he's firstborn. Well, what about Simeon and Levi? What about second and third? Well, those guys mess up too. Because as we hear later on, their sister, Dinah, is kidnapped and raped. And so these brothers take vengeance upon the men of that city, wipe them all out. And because of that, in Genesis 49, Jacob is going to skip also Simeon and Levi, referring to their violence. And that leaves son number 4, the praise son, Judah. He's the one in Genesis 49 that receives the blessing and the praise of his father. So much so that Jacob says that this will be the patriarch from whose tribe will come the ruler. And not just guys like David and Solomon and Rehoboam and all the other kings like Hezekiah and Josiah, but the ruler who is to come. Because eventually it will be from the praise son's line, the tribe of Judah, that the lion of the tribe of Judah will be born. Now, you knew all that, but imagine that you're Leah and you don't know that. You're in an unhappy marriage. Things are not great ever at home. And you were able to take this time machine back and to have a conversation with Leah and to say, now, I know things are not great, but let me tell you what's going to happen in the future. I think if you could tell her that her fourth-born son is going to be the one from whom will come the kings of Israel, and the one who eventually would come, the King of Kings, the one who would live and die and rise again to pay for the sins of all humanity, including Leah's. If you could tell her that, I expect that her face would explode with a smile that would outsmile any smile that we can imagine. You see, there's very often things that we experience in life that are tragedies or pains or disappointments or whatever it might be. And maybe it's a marriage, maybe it's a job, maybe it's parents, maybe it's who knows what it is. And we're struggling. We're like Romans 8:28ing it. Like, well, I know that God's going to cause all things to work together for the good of this, but I have no idea what that's going to look like. And maybe you never will. Maybe you'll die unaware of the good that God brought out of whatever it is you went through. Well, it's a good thing that the God that we worship does not die. He's the one who lives on, and he's the one who has all of history in his hands. And he's the one who's able to bring good out of evil, good out of disappointment. Not just in our lifetime, but in lifetimes which are still to come. The thing that you're suffering from, God is able to use that to bring good into the lives of others, maybe even in your own lifetime that you don't even realize. Have you ever had somebody come to you and say, man, I just want to thank you for what you did for me 20 years ago, or what you said to me 20 years ago. It really meant a lot to me. And you say to them, well, you're very welcome. I was glad to do it. And then later you're like, I have no idea what they're talking about. No clue. You've forgotten. They didn't. There's so many things like that happen in our lives. God is able to use things that we do, things that we say, sometimes in the midst of tremendous tragedies, in order to bring good, plant good seeds of hope and faith and love into the hearts of other people. So never imagine that any loss that you experience is truly a loss. Never imagine that any suffering you undergo is not going to bear fruit somewhere else. We worship a God who's bigger than that. We worship a God who's able to take your pain and your suffering and your disappointment and to use that to create good in other people's lives that sometimes, thanks be to God, we hear about and sometimes we don't hear about. But God is able to do that and does do that. He did it for Leah. He does it for all of us. Now we're going to have to kind of fast forward a little bit here because we only have about 6 minutes or so left. Jacob is in exile for a long time. 20 years. I like to refer to his period of exile as the fruitful winter. An ironic phrase. The fruitful winter, because it's in the winter that God is able to actually produce fruit in our lives that he can't always do when the sun is shining and it's warm outside and there's flowers everywhere and everything is just great in our lives. But in the winter, God can work, does work. He did that certainly in Jacob's life. What did he leave with? A staff. And now, he eventually is going to come back with, 4 wives, 11 sons. Benjamin's going to be born after they get back. At least one daughter, probably many daughters at this point. And then flocks, herds, male servants, female servants. He leaves basically with nothing and is to come back full. Isn't that just the way that God works, though? Very often when we go into exile, we go with thinking this is it. I've lost it all. I have nothing. And then when we come out of that, with an enriched understanding of who we are and who the God is that we serve. Because in our weakness, we begin to realize that God is our strength. And those situations in life where we don't have everything together, it's when we realize it's okay because God does. And he's able to work through the confusion and chaos of our lives to bring blessings into our lives that we can't bring on our own. I'll say it again, like I said it in our first hour together. The moment in history when you realize that God is able to bring good out of exile is the resurrection of Jesus. When he cries out from the cross, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, my God, why have you forsaken me? He goes on to say, the psalm goes on to say, why are you so far from me? Why are you so far from my groaning? Oh my God, I cry out by day and by night, but you don't answer. Why are you so far from me? Jesus is going into exile on the cross. He's going all the way, in fact, not just into the exile of death, but the exile of the grave. He's going into the exile of exiles, the farthest exile that you could possibly experience in the grave itself. And then 3 days later, he's going to walk out of there. He's going to return from exile. And when Christ returns from exile, so do you. So do you. You're on his shoulders as he walks out of that grave. If anyone is in Christ, he's a new creation. Those who believe in me, even though they die, yet shall they live. And he who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? Yes. Because he's the resurrection and the life. Because it means that when your body is placed into the grave, or when you put the body of your spouse or your child or your best friend or your parents or whoever it is, you put them in the grave, you think that's the end? Oh no, they've just relocated. They've just changed their address from here to the presence of Christ. And the body's not going to stay there. This is not the final resting place of their body. It's the temporary resting place until Christ returns again. And the full impact of his own resurrection will be felt as trumpets sound and bodies like corks from champagne pop out of the ground, alive glorious, perfect, resurrected to mirror the resurrected body of our Lord. All of this is going to happen to you. You're going to live forever. Forever. Because Christ came out of exile. He came out of the grave. He stood alive, and he stands alive still today. The greatest thing that was ever accomplished for humanity happened as a result of exile, the exile of Jesus and his return. So if you think God can do that with the exile of Jesus and his resurrection, do you really think he can't do the same with you? Now, I know it's hard to believe that. I know it's really hard to believe that. When you're caught in the midst of your own exile, you feel like God has abandoned you, or you feel like God has become your enemy, or you feel like God is too busy governing the universe that he has no time for you, or you feel like you bang on heaven's door over and over and over and over and there's no answer. God is hearing you. God is loving you. And God is waiting, biding his time to bring you out of exile. So you know what? Keep banging on that door. Keep crying out to God. Don't stop trusting, because the God in whom you trust loves you. And just like he brought Jesus out of the grave of exile, he's going to bring you out of the grave of exile as well. And when he does, you'll have a better understanding of who you are. You have a much better understanding of who the God is that we worship. The God who brings life out of death, hope out of despair, a living, resurrected body out of the deepest grave that there is. Because ultimately, the one who is the resurrection and the life will never stop giving life to all of us. I'm going to stop there. We're at 11:35, and I think we're going to have some food. Tyler,
We're going to
turn it over to you.
Yes.
It's a tough hour to talk. I'll try and speak as monotone as possible so as not to disturb your napping. Just try not to snore. That's all I ask. So I wasn't joking when I told you I say the best for last, because the book Limping with God is based on a particular incident, which we haven't got to yet, but which we're about to get to. So that is going to be what we're talking about in the next 45 minutes, something like that. Okay, so first of all, I do want to say about 2 minutes worth of material about the best Christian nonprofit on the planet. And I do exaggerate sometimes, but I'm not exaggerating this time. So 1517 began many, many years ago. Not much was going on with it. I mean, they were publishing a few books and doing a little bit of this and that, but not much was happening really until around 2016, 17, especially with the 500th anniversary of the Reformation. Things began to explode is probably not an exaggeration, began to greatly expand. That was around the time that I got connected with them, along with my friend Dan Price, along with a whole lot of us who now work for 1517. And I can see in hindsight what God was doing. He was plugging us all together in order that with all our various talents and perspectives and backgrounds, that God is going to be able to use us all in this multifaceted way to do what we do. And what we do is basically get the good news of our freedom and forgiveness in Christ in like the parable of the sower of the seed, but just go around throwing it everywhere. And some of it lands on rocky soil, and some of it lands among the thorns, and who knows where it lands. But we're throwing it out via podcast and videos and in-person events and our publishing house and all kinds of other ways, in order basically that we can share the riches that we have in Christ with a world that is dying for the freedom and forgiveness that we have in Christ. Now, I'm privileged to be able to teach the Old Testament, teach the gospel with an Old Testament accent. That's my focus. We have other guys who are New Testament people. We have people who are more into history. We have folks who are more into doctrine and apologetics, family, you name it, whatever kind of you're into theologically, or however you consume your theology, whether it's through books, or whether it's through videos, or whether it's through podcasts, or whether it's the in-person events. However you like it, we've got it, basically. So, love doing what I do. Love the 1517 family. My wife, Stacy, who's here taking a picture of me or video of me, she works full-time for 1517 as well. And Lana does, who's also with us this weekend. We're a big family, really are a family. Love what we do. And love having the chance to come out and spend time with you doing this. I know not all of you are part of St. John's. You're from a variety of congregations. So do know this. We are always happy to partner with congregations. In fact, Eric Sorensen, who works for us, that's his job, basically. It's connected with congregations. So if you're interested in that, let one of us know. We'll get you in touch with Eric, and we can connect you guys together so that we can work together with you as a congregation. And I say this everywhere I go, and I'll keep saying it too. You know, if there's one thing nonprofits never say no to, it's what? Money. Because we're non-profits, and so we live on donations. We live on the goodness and the generosity of the people of God. So if you're interested in joining the large group of very generous people who support us and enable us to do what we do, then we would love to talk to you about that as well. That's 1517. By the way, named after when the Reformation began. I always get that question, so if you've ever wondered, it's not like Genesis 1517 or Romans 1517, but it's the year 1517 when Martin Luther nailed those 95 Theses on the church door in Wittenberg. So that's 1517. All right, now back to Jacob. Where did we leave him? What was he doing? Oh, he was getting married and married and married and married and having kids and kids and kids and kids and getting his wages changed by Uncle Laban and all of this stuff that was going on in his life. You know, I think he could have kept a counselor like fully employed just talking to him during those years. Not to mention his wives and kids and everything else. Well, I did mention that he, had grown, of course. His family had grown, his possessions had grown. He was pretty well off. He wasn't living paycheck to paycheck by the time that he left. We're not going to look into it, but there's that whole story too of where he got all the spotted and speckled goats and sheep from his father-in-law. So he had this occasion, which God often does, where he takes from those who are oppressing the people of God and then gives it to the people of God. That's what happened in the Exodus, right? They left with the spoils of Egypt. God took from their oppressors and gave it to them. Same thing is happening in the life of Jacob also. So I do want to touch on one thing that happened before he got back that I think is worth talking about, because this is something that connects very well with our lives. So Laban, I mentioned he was a Pharaoh character. He was a problem. He was a thorn in the side of Jacob all those years. Any of you had a boss like that? Or a father-in-law? No, don't answer that. We've all had Labans in our lives. Maybe you have a Laban in your life right now, right? Could be. So dealing with Labans is difficult. So how do you manage this? And then especially if you have a Laban in your life that finally everything kind of comes to a head. And something's got to change. You can't keep working there. Well, this is an acquaintance that you just can't hang out with anymore. Whatever the situation is, something has to change. What are you going to do? Well, this is kind of what happened here with Jacob and Laban. So Jacob gathers his whole entourage together and they head back home with God's blessing. And they do this while Laban and his crew are shearing sheep off in another area. They sneak away, more or less. So they're heading back to the promised land. Laban receives word, and what does Laban do? He chases him down. He catches up with him. In fact, he's fuming. He's not fuming. Don't let him deceive you. He's not fuming because he's like, oh, I wanted to throw a party for my grandkids and my daughters, whatever. This is Laban, okay? So take everything he says with 10 grains of salt. He didn't want to lose Jacob to begin with, because all of this had been happening, the good things have been happening for 14 years. That was why he first didn't want to lose him. And then he didn't want to lose him because he had lost everything to Jacob. He was probably looking for a chance to get it back. So he catches up with him. And this whole scene, I wish we had time to look into it. We don't, but read it on your own and laugh your way through it. Because remember, Rachel stole the gods, the whole household idols. And Laban is rummaging through everybody's tents and everybody's stuff. He's looking for the gods. And all the while, Rachel's sitting on these gods, which is just hilarious. And so Laban's mad. Jacob, he finally loses his cool. I don't think I've ever seen him this angry. He's furious. And you can kind of picture these guys. You ever see one of these arguments where, one's in the other's face and they're yelling at each other and the spit's flying, one of those kind of arguments? That's how I picture Laban and Jacob. Spit's flying, fists are shaking. But Laban has been warned the night before by God, don't you touch Jacob. Don't you do him any harm. But Laban can still yell at him. So they have these yelling match, and they're all venting their grievances. You did this to me. Well, yeah, but you did this to me. Back and forth, back and forth. Finally, the temperatures begin to cool a little bit. And they make an agreement. They cut a covenant, basically. They have a sacrifice. They make their oaths. And the oath is basically this. Okay, we're going to go two different ways. I'm going to go back home, Laban says, and you're going to go this way. And only thing I ask is you take care of my daughters. All right, that's all I'm asking. Jacob says, all right, deal. So they come to peace. They make an agreement. You might say, reconcile, forgive, however you want to put it. And then one goes that way, and the other goes that way. And never did they come back together again. I don't remember when this first came to me, but I think this is a biblical example, biblical model for what sometimes happens in our lives. Must we forgive? I didn't say should. I said, must we forgive those who sin against us? Jesus makes that abundantly clear. He never says, if you want to, then you can forgive up to 3 times. Or 7 times, or whatever it might be. No, you forgive, right? So must we forgive? Yes, we must forgive. In fact, that's the only thing in the Lord's Prayer that we do. It's the only activity, only verb that we do in the Lord's Prayer is forgive those who trespass against us. But that doesn't mean that we continue to be an integral part of the person's life every single time. Is that ideal? Absolutely. But are there people, and I can think of people in my own life, are there people with whom it's good to forgive, to make a pact, to come to peace, and then say, God bless you, have a good life? Yes, I believe there are. This sometimes happens in the scriptures, where it doesn't mean that you have some sort of animosity against them. It just means that, you're gasoline, they're fire. Use whatever analogy you want to use. You are created in such a way and personality in such a way that it's best to be at peace with them and then to move on. That's what happened in the case of Jacob and Laban. Now he's reconciled with Laban, but he's not yet reconciled with his true fear. And that true fear is who? Esau. Yeah. So what are we going to do about that? Well, we're going to pick up here with Genesis chapter, 32 is, I guess, where we'll go to. Jacob's on his way back. Now, Genesis 32 is where we're going to start, and let's go to, verse 3. So Jacob sends messengers before him to his brother Esau, who lives in the land of Seir, the country of Edom. So this is directly south of the Dead Sea. And he commanded them, saying, thus you shall say to my lord Esau. Remember what I said earlier? He doesn't say to my brother Esau. It's to my lord Esau. It's what you want to say to my lord Esau. So here's what your servant Jacob says. I have sojourned with Laban and stayed until now, and I have oxen and donkeys and flocks and male and female servants, and I have sent to my lord that I may find favor in your sight. What's Jacob doing? He's trying to win some favor with his brother, right? Yeah. He's sending all these gifts ahead. He's like, I got stuff now. I got a lot of things, and I'm wanting to share these with you. I'm going to give you all these gifts. In fact, later on, he's going to say as much. I was trying to win favor in your sight. This is very much of a Jacob activity, right? How can I take advantage of this situation in order to get on the good side of this guy that might, I don't know, maybe still be mad at me? I don't know. I haven't had any discussions with him for 20 years. I hope he's not, but you never know. So he says to his messengers, his servants, go ahead and tell Esau this. Good plan, right? Well, maybe not. Because verse 6 says, when the messengers come back to Jacob, they say, well, we found your brother Esau, and he is coming to meet you, and he's got 400 guys with him. And I don't think they're just the welcome party. See, 400 men in the biblical narrative is the number of a military militia. So when Jacob hears that Esau has 400 men coming to meet him, there's only one logical conclusion that Jacob comes to. Esau is out for a pound of flesh. Esau's out for blood. He's been waiting for this opportunity. Revenge is a dessert best served cold, and it's been chilling for a long, long time. So, verse 7 says, Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed. So he starts kind of divvying things up. He's like, oh, I'm going to put half of my stuff over here and then half over here that, maybe if this half gets destroyed, the other half can get away. He's gambling. He's trying to figure out, okay, what can I do to mitigate my losses here? And then he prays. We're not going to look at that just for the sake of time. But he prays to God, and then he begins to kind of divvy things up into these groups. And he sends a group ahead and says, all right, give these to Esau. Next group, give these to Esau. So he's putting a plan into action. Is this not Jacob, though? Talk about a planner and a plotter. I mean, he's got a plan. Even with his distress, even with his fear, he's like, I got to do something here. Let's see, what can I do? Oh, yeah, I'll do this, I'll do that. And I'll try and manipulate the situation to where I can curry favor with. And my brother, maybe by the time he gets here, after he sees all these gifts, he won't be quite as murderously angry with me. Maybe. Okay. Well, we're going to get to that. But something interrupts it. Something interrupts this that I want us to spend some time on. So he's got everybody divided up. He sends his whole family across the Jabbok River. So if you can picture a map of Israel, you got the Sea of Galilee up here, you got the Dead Sea down here, you got the Jordan, that snakes its way down. Well, flowing from the east into the Jordan River is the Jabbok. Okay? It's in the Transjordan area. So the Jabbok River is right there. He sends everybody across. And I wish I knew why. But verse 24 tells us that Jacob was left alone. Why was he left alone? Did he need some time to think through what was about to happen? Did he need some time to pray? Was he just needing some time alone? I'm really tired of everybody. I just need some time by myself. Whatever it was, he was left alone. Now, when's the last time we heard about Jacob being alone? Oh, yeah. At the beginning of his exile. See how these are the bookends? At the very beginning of his exile at Bethel, where he has the vision, the dream vision of the stairway and the angels and Jesus speaking to him, he was alone. Not just alone, but it was at night. And God appeared to him and spoke to him. That was the beginning of exile. Fast forward 20 years, it's the end of exile. Once again, Jacob is alone. And it's at night. And God is going to appear to him. But man, this appearance, this time, is not just unlike the first appearance. There is nothing in the entirety of the scriptures that comes close to what's going to happen here. The only thing I can think of that comes remotely close to this narrative is when Jesus kind of goes crazy in the temple and starts overturning tables and has the whip and is letting the animals go. That's the only time I can think of that comes close to the Son of God acting in this sort of very physical, we might say even wild or violent way as to what's going to happen here. So he's left alone, and we're told that a man wrestled with him until daybreak. Now, I've already told you who this is. In fact, we talked about it when we talked about the beginning of exile. There's multiple times when the Son of God appears in the Old Testament, and this is one of them. Now, he's called three different things. He's called a man, just the regular Hebrew word for man, which is ish. Nothing unusual about that. Later in this narrative, he's called God. Jacob's going to say, I saw God face to face. So he's God, and he's called a man. And then Hosea will reflect back on this narrative, and he will also refer to this mysterious figure as a messenger. Sometimes it's translated as angel, but in Hebrew, malach, which is the word they translate as angel, just means messenger. So he's a man, he's God, and he's a messenger. Well, there's only one person this could fit, and that's the Son of God. It's amazing how many times, by the way, I just recently listened to 2 presentations online about this. Neither one of them mentioned anything about Jesus. I'm continually astonished that Jesus does not come up when this text is being discussed. They said God, but I'm like, yeah, but tell me more. God wrestled with him. Okay, who? What God are we talking about? Well, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Well, who was it? It was the Son of God. This is Jesus wrestling with Jacob. He has temporarily assumed a human nature. He's appearing as a man. This is not his incarnation, don't get me wrong. But he's temporarily assumed a human form, so human, in fact, that he can fight. He can get him in a half Nelson. He can do whatever it takes to wrestle with him. This is not some ghostly form who's wrestling with. You can't wrestle with a ghost. You have to wrestle with someone who's flesh and blood. So the Son of God has temporarily assumed this flesh and blood form to wrestle with Jacob. Now, this is a theological aside, but it's worth saying. Isn't it wonderful how Jesus, throughout the Old Testament, has tapped us on the shoulder again and again and again to tell us, hey, guess what? I'm going to become a human being. He does it already when he makes Adam and Eve in his image and likeness. He's giving us a hint of the coming incarnation. And then he does it repeatedly when the Son of God shows up and assumes a human form. One author calls all of these Jesus trying on the clothes of his incarnation. Isn't that beautiful? He's trying on the clothes of his incarnation. He's practicing, you might say. These are dress rehearsals for the incarnation. And this is one of these. So a man wrestled with him until daybreak. Verse 25 tells us, when he saw that he had not prevailed against him, that is to say, when Jesus saw that he had not prevailed against Jacob, he fought dirty. That's actually not what it says. That's the Chadbury paraphrase. He touched the socket of his thigh, and the socket of Jacob's thigh was dislocated while he wrestled with him. Don't you love kind of the counterpoint going on here? So they're wrestling. They're going at it. You can imagine blood. There's mud all over them. There's sweat, grunting. If you ever watch 2 guys wrestle, you know this is some intense activity. My son Luke used to wrestle, and I don't know how these guys wrestled all night, because even these guys who were teens, by the time they've been on the mat for 3 or 4 minutes, they're wiped out. This goes on and on. They're wrestling. They're fighting. And at the same time, all it takes is for Jesus to reach out and boop, just touch his hip, and it's shattered. It's dislocated. Now, what does that tell you? It tells you that Jesus could easily, at any moment, have stopped this and won the fight, right? I mean, you know this. Do you actually fight with the Son of God and think that you're going to win? I mean, any moment, he could have simply, or touch him, or just not even touch him, just did it as God. And the fight's over. But he does this. He dislocates his thigh. And then he says, let me go, for the day is breaking. I think probably what's going on here is it's still dark. And he doesn't want Jacob to see his face. I suspect that's what's happening. Dawn is breaking. So let me go. Now, what do you think Jacob is going to say? We know Jacob by now. You think he's really going to kind of roll over and say, all right, well, thanks for the match. Adios. Of course, Jacob is going to take advantage of this situation, right? That's who Jacob is. And so for all his flaws, for all his warts, for all of his problems, I greatly admire Jacob here because he says, no, not going to let you go unless you bless me. I'm going to hang on to you. This moment reminds me of Job. So if you're doing Bible in 1 year with me, we've been in Job. And one of the things I love about Job is he won't let go. He will not let go. I mentioned earlier pounding on heaven's door. That's Job. His fist is bloody. He's beating on that door, and he's not going to stop. He's crying out to God. He's lamenting to God, which is exactly what we do in these kind of situations. So when you're going through a dark season in your life, you don't crawl up in a ball and say, well, I guess God's done with me. I'm not going to talk to him. Or you certainly don't talk to him as if everything's okay. You know how often we lie when we pray? We're not honest when we pray. Like if you hooked up a lie detector to us when we prayed, it would go crazy because we're not telling the truth. When you pray, be honest. God already knows. If you're mad at him, tell him you're mad at him. If you're confused by him, tell him you're confused by him. If you want to cry out, where are you? And why? And how long? Well, then say, where are you? And why? And how long? Because that's exactly what the Psalms do. Psalm 13. How long, O Lord? You going to be angry forever? How long? Are you going to forget me? How long is my enemy going to triumph? How long is this going to go on? Don't ever let anybody tell you shouldn't question God. This is exactly what the psalmists do over and over and over. They question God. They're crying out to God. So what do you do when you think God is against you? You turn toward him and you pray. You lament. You pour out your heart before him. Blessed are those who lament, Jesus says. Blessed are those who cry, who weep, for they should be comforted. So you don't let go. You hold on to God with an iron grip and you say, do something. Answer me. If you've ever seen the movie The Apostle, it's that great scene when he's in the upper room and he's talking to God and he's just letting God have it. He's just pouring it all out. It's just like the Psalms. That's what Jacob does here too. He's hanging on. Nope, not going to let you go unless you bless me. Now, isn't this kind of cool too when you think about what he did with his father? He's all deceit and lies, pretending to be his brother, all to get a blessing. And now, finally, he's going to get the blessing that counts. He's going to get the blessing that comes from the mouth of God himself. So, verse 27, Jesus said to him, what's your name? I love that. I always picture there's a slight pause. John. My name is Heel. My name is Jacob. And I have lived down to my name. I have healed with 2 E's. I've tripped up. I've lied. I've deceived. I've done everything for me. I'm Jacob. That's who I am. And verse 28. Your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Yisrael. For you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. I think Israel is, by far, the coolest name ever. I wish we would name more kids Israel. It comes from 2 words. Sarah, which means to struggle, to fight. And then El, which means God. Now, ordinarily, if you have what's called the theophoric element in a name, that just means the God part in a name, then God is the subject of whatever verb is built into that name. So ordinarily, if you hear Yisrael, you would think it meant God fights, God being the subject. But that's not what's happening here. It's a reversal. God says your name's going to be Israel because you have fought, striven with God and with men. And don't miss the last part. And have prevailed. Now just let that seep into your soul. And think about the implications of that. Your name is going to be God fighter. Israel. Because all your life you have striven with men, beginning with your brother Esau, and then your father Isaac, and then certainly all those years with Laban and probably with Laban's sons as well. You've been fighting tooth and nail your entire life, Jacob. You've striven with men over and over. And now, guess what? Now you're also fighting with me, with God. Now, if you were to just kind of begin that sentence and then ask me to finish it, here's how I would have finished it. You've striven with God and with men, and God has prevailed. That's not what it says. Who wins? Who prevails? Jacob. Yeah, I have arguments with people about this. They're like, no. Jacob can't win. What does it say? It's like right there in black and white. You've striven with God and with men. Let me make sure I'm not misreading this. And have prevailed. That means you won. How? How in the world could Jacob win? You can't fight against God and win. Maybe you can fight against your brother and your uncle and your boss and your dad, and you can win. Okay, fine. You can't fight against God and win. No way. Oh, yes you can. You can fight against God and win. Jacob did. Now, the only way that you fight against God and win, of course, we all know this, is when God lets you win. Now, I got two grandsons. I got Colt and I got Bowen. And I can beat them both up. They're kids. Now, there will come a day when they can beat me up. But now, I got them. They're young. I could beat them both up. I could grab both of them at the same time. And I could pin them both to the ground without breaking a sweat. But when we wrestle, do you think I do that? No, of course not. I'm their pop. Stacy's Lolly. Isn't that cute? Lollipop. Oh. So I'm pop, and these are my grandsons, and I love them, and I want them to win. So what do? I roll over, and they push me down. I say, you got me. You win. You prevailed. I do that because I want them to win, because I love them. I want them on top. I want them to pin me, and so I let them, out of my love for them, win. Do you think God is any different? Our love pales in comparison to even a droplet of his love. Our love is a drop, his is an ocean. And he wants us to win. He wanted Jacob to win, and Jacob did. Jacob pinned God. He won the fight. And God wanted him to win the fight. And the result was God gave him this new name of God-fighter. Thenceforth, forever after that, Jacob, Israel, had a new name and a new identity. No longer was he simply the heel, the name that he could live down to. But now he's the God-fighter, a name that he can strive to live up to. Now, I would argue that what's happening in this beautiful narrative, that's full of mystery at the same time, is that we are given a little window into another fight with much, much greater, in fact, universal impact upon all of humanity. Jacob is wrestling with Jesus, and Jesus lets him win. And Jesus lets him win in order that he can bestow a blessing upon Jacob. Generations later, this same mystery man, who is also God, will actually become incarnate among us. And you know what we will do the entire time that he's here on earth? We will fight him. The whole ministry of Jesus is fighting. People fighting with Jesus, challenging him, trying to trip him up, plotting against him, struggling against him. The very first time he preaches in his hometown, what do they try and do? Throw that kid off the cliff. He's too big for his britches. The very first time he preaches, these are his people. He grew up with them, and they want to kill him. And that's the start of his ministry. It doesn't change. The whole ministry of Jesus is one big wrestling match between Jesus and humanity. And finally, they get their hands on him. They arrest him in the Garden of Gethsemane. They have this ridiculous trial. He's convicted on false charges. He's handed over. He's whipped. He's mocked. He's led out to crucifixion. He's impaled upon the cross. He hangs there, bleeding, dying, losing, pinned to the cross, precisely in order that every single one of you might win. And you receive a new name. You are no longer called Jacob. Now you're called forgiven, beloved, free, a child of God. That's your new name. And you get this new name all because God would rather lose even his own life than lose you. So he's willing to be pinned on the cross. He's willing to be wrestled down into death itself in order that he might bestow upon you that which can only come by him losing so that you can win. Now, if that's not beautiful good news, I don't know what is. That's what happened with Jacob. That's what happens with us as well. But you know, there are consequences that follow this. There are consequences. They're good consequences, though. Because we read on that Jacob asks his name, and he says, "Why do you ask my name?" Is that not a Jesus question too? I've always said that, you ask Jesus, "What time is it?" And he would say, "There was a man who..." I was just like wondering what time it was. He's always got these weird ways of responding. "Why do you ask my name?" We'll find out his name much later because the angel will tell Mary and Joseph what to name him. So, why do you ask my name? And he blessed him there. So Jacob called the name of that place Peniel because he said, "I've seen God face to face, and yet my life has been preserved." Now, here's the consequence. Verse 31. Now the sun rose upon him just as he crossed over Penuel, and he was limping on his thigh. And therefore to this day the sons of Israel don't eat the sinew of the hip which is on the socket of the thigh, because he touched the socket of Jacob's thigh and the sinew of the hip. Kind of a strange way to end the story, isn't it? With this reference to what you can and what you can't eat. Strange, but fitting. So here's a couple things to think about. Jacob walked away from this encounter with God with a limp. And there's no indication that he ever fully recovered from this. I like to think that Jacob was limping the whole rest of his life. A constant reminder of a life-altering encounter with the God who blesses us in the midst of a fight. And at the same time, we are radically changed. Ironically, we don't leave the fight stronger. We leave the fight weaker in ourselves, but stronger in God. When you wrestle with God, in whatever form that takes, when you wrestle with God, you emerge with a blessing, but you also emerge with a limp, a wound, a scar. And this scar or this limp is a constant reminder to you of your own inherent weakness. And I would also add the fact that this life is short. It's temporary. It's ephemeral. And there will come a day when that limp, that wound, that scar will be erased and healed in the resurrection on the last day. But in this life, you have the thorn in the flesh, you have the wound, you have the limp, you have the scar. I'm glad that I have a limp. I'm glad that I have a scar. I got multiple scars. So do you. Whatever they look like. Now, some of our scars are very visible. Some of our scars are not. In fact, some of us do take great pains to hide our scars because we don't want others to see them. I would urge you never to hide your scars, never to act like you don't limp. Embrace it. Better than that, better than just embracing it, realize that when you have an encounter with God, in whatever form that takes, and you walk away changed, that you realize that God is calling you to a high and holy calling. Henceforth, you are called to be a steward of that scar. You're called to be one who manages that limp. You're called to be one who takes whatever you have suffered and to translate that into an opportunity to love and to serve and to give hope and healing to others who experience similar scars and wounds and limps. That's one of the reasons that God had me kicking and screaming, but finally got me to the point to where I talk about my own past as much as I do. Not because I like to, I don't, but because I try to give hope to others who have experienced something that I'm going through. It's the reason I decided early on, after we lost our son Luke, to talk about him, to talk about grief. Because in this way, I can hopefully give expression to what other people are feeling inside who are dealing with grief, and at the same time to give them the hope, the share of the same hope that we have, that our departed loved ones who believe in Christ are with him, and that we will one day see them again because Jesus lives, and because he lives, we live in him. So I try to be a good steward of my own scars, those self-inflicted and those inflicted just because we live in a broken world. And you can do the same. Paul says it this way. He says that we give hope to others with the same hope with which we have received from God, or we comfort others with the same comfort that we ourselves have been comforted by God. You see how this works? We're not all little Christian islands. We're all a continent. We're all bound together in the body of Christ. And so when one hurts, another comes in and helps. When one is limping, another comes in and says, yeah, let me tell you about my limp and how God helped me through this. Because in that way, it can be an encouragement to one another. And in that way, too, we can drop the stupid facade as if we have everything together in our lives. Nobody does. If there's someone that you look at them and you're like, man, that person, they never miss a beat. They have really got everything together. I guarantee you it's all a lie. No one does. We all have our issues. We all have our problems. We all have our scars and wounds and limps. So that's fine. Be honest about it. Turns out Christianity is not about a whole bunch of saintly, perfect people gathering together. It's about a whole bunch of wounded, limping, scarred sinners getting together, all of whom are loved by Jesus Christ and given hope and healing by him. And the more that we can exemplify this as the body of Christ, then the more the world itself is going to sit up and take notice because, oh, look at those people. They're just like we are, except they have hope. So Jacob walks away from this, and the Israelites to this day don't eat that part of the sinew because this is their way of keeping alive that memory of what happened to Jacob. Now, this is not the end of the story of Jacob, although we're going to stop here. Jacob's going to go on to be reunited with his brother, which we didn't get to, but you can read that on your own. Jacob's going to go on to not be a good guy when his daughter is kidnapped and raped. Jacob's going to go on to suffer greatly when he loses Joseph. Jacob's going to go on to be an old man in Egypt and there to bless Pharaoh himself. And then one day, Jacob is going to end his years in this world while he's still in Egypt. And as you follow his life from beginning to end, I think what you see here is a beautiful example of a human being who goes through what all of us go through. Struggles in relationships? Yeah. Struggles with himself? Yes. Struggles with God? Absolutely. And the one who really never lives up to the great calling that God has given to him, but who nevertheless is always loved by God and chosen by God and protected by God and carried by God from literally the womb to the tomb. From the time we meet him wrestling with his brother in utero to the time when we see him embalmed and carried in this great funeral procession and laid to rest in the land of promise itself as a down payment of what is to come. And I love the life of Jacob for all those reasons, because I see in him me and you, but above all, I see in his life a mirror of the love that God had for him as the same love that God has for us in Jesus Christ, now and always. And I'll stop there. Thanks. Yeah. All right.
Chad,
now we're going to have easy questions time. I believe that's what this is entitled.
Easy ones. Just the easy
questions.
ones.
Yeah. So if you have any questions, we have one or maybe two mics. So
Yeah, Dave's got a mic over there. I'll have one here. So if you have a question, please raise it high so that we can see them. If we don't get to your question, please don't be offended. But yes. Okay. So we'll
got
start.
a couple over here.
Would you explain the significance of the angels coming up and down the ladder? I get it, that it's a connection between us and God, but I never got understood why the angels.
Yeah, I think this is a case where you have a common motif in their culture, which is adopted in this vision to communicate this pathway between earth and heaven. So I didn't mention this when we were going over it, but you probably are familiar with what a ziggurat is. Ziggurats were these man-made mountains, basically, in the ancient Near East, of which you can, look them up online if you've never seen one, a picture of one. But basically, ziggurats are these pyramid kind of structures that are designed to be a mountain, because in the ancient Near East, gods were understood to especially inhabit mountains. That's why we have Mount Sinai, that's why we have Mount Zion, that's why we have Mount Olympus, or Mount Zaphon among the Canaanites. That's why you have the Mount of Transfiguration. God is pictured as appearing on mountaintops. So this would have been a common image that Jacob and everyone else would have been familiar with in that culture. So the image is of heaven up here at the top of the mountain and then earth here at the bottom of the mountain. And thus the angels going up and down would have been just like if you go up the top of the ziggurat or down the bottom of the ziggurat. I think it was basically an image that anyone would have been familiar with, including Jacob, to communicate with him this idea that this is the place where heaven and earth meet, and you have this stairway, just like the stairway of the ziggurat, which angels go up and down. Yeah, great question. This table is full of questions.
On the birthright, when Esau sold his birthright to Jacob, I understand that, but if the birthright was basically the rights of the firstborn, then why did Esau react so violently when later in life when he deceived their father?
Yeah, that's a great question. This is one of these cases where I wish we had some more literary parallels that we could compare this to, as we do with a lot of things in the scriptures, where we can compare kind of cultural norms or even cultural laws in the Bible to other law codes or something like that in the ancient Near East. We don't have anything that parallels this that we found so far in literature. So what seems to be the case, based upon what we can put together from the scriptures, is that you kind of had a 50-50, a twofold kind of two events that had to happen. You had to have, first of all, the right of the firstborn, and then you had to have the blessing that the father gave. And if you had one without the other, it wasn't enough. So Jacob's goal is not just to have the birthright, kind of this legality, but also to have the verbal blessing of his father. And so probably what Esau was thinking was, no big deal. I can still get my father's blessing, and that's going to count more than the loss of my birthright. That's the best that I can figure out, because part of that's guesswork, simply because we don't have anything else to compare this with from other literature of that time. Great question, though. Anybody else? Red shirt over here. Up here we have a question. Yes, sir.
When you took care of the estate while Jacob was gone, and when Jacob was returning, you said it was roughly 20 years. Is that when his father had passed away?
His father passed away after Jacob got back. In fact, I think it just covered in 1 or 2 verses that Jacob and Esau reunited to bury their father, which I've always thought to be a touching scene, that they got back together. I mean, they had their reunion, which we didn't get a chance to look at. But then after that, there's no mention of them getting back together again until the death of their father. So presumably what would have happened is that Isaac would continue to manage everything after Jacob left. And then Esau, we know, had gone his own way. He went to the south of the Dead Sea and kind of started forming his own clan, his own family from there. And while we're talking about this, since we have time, do keep reading where we stopped in Genesis 32. Turn the page to Genesis 33. This is worth pointing out. And I know we're doing Q&A here, but just give me a minute here. You would think that if you experienced what Jacob experienced, the new name, the blessing, that you would be a changed person, right? In fact, yesterday, I was on the treadmill at the hotel and listening to an old sermon by, what's his name, Martin Lloyd-Jones on Genesis 32, just for the heck of it, just because I'm weird that way. And he was talking about how Genesis 32 was like Jacob was a changed man after that. He was a changed man after that. But was he? Really? Because the very next episode is when he's reunited with Esau. And remember how this goes? Esau says, tell you what, brother, so happy you're home. Why don't you come back with me to my place, south of the Dead Sea? And Jacob's like, well, we'd love to, but we got all the kids and the animals that kind of slow us down. Esau's like, no problem. I'll leave some guys with you and they can escort you down to my place. He's like, no, really. I don't want to be a bother, brother. Thank you, though. We'll catch up with you. Esau's like, okay, cool. We'll see you. And so Esau and his group, they head south, and they disappear over the horizon, and Jacob's like, all right, gather your stuff. We're going north. Jacob received a new name, we might say an additional name. He's now Israel, but guess what? Jacob's still Jacob. Jacob's still Jacob. So in the Reformation, we talk about how we are simul justus et peccator, a Latin phrase that means we're simultaneously justified and sinners. We have this ongoing Romans 7 civil war going on inside us. And that's exactly what happened with Jacob. Same thing that happens to us. So if you ever wonder why the good you don't want to do, why the bad you don't want to do, you end up doing, and the good that you do want to do, you don't do, you're Jacob. You have the ongoing civil war within you. And sometimes you do end up doing the good thing, and sometimes you end up avoiding the bad thing, but a lot of times you don't. That's because you're still a sinner, even though you're also loved and justified and forgiven by Christ. So anyway, that's kind of an aside because that's part of the whole Jacob and Esau ongoing story. Okay, sure. Then we have a question over here when you're done.
So my question is maybe convoluted a little bit, but I'm curious. So when Jacob wrestles with Christ, and then Christ gives him the name Israel to say, you struggled with God and man and have prevailed. Mm-hmm. As I'm thinking forward to what Christ does as a conqueror and as one who says, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me, right?
Yeah.
So it almost seems like as he gives the name Israel, it's almost a covenant because ultimately he knows he's coming from the line of Israel to be a conqueror. And the next thing that happens in Israel's life is ultimately Joseph goes to Egypt, the whole family goes to Egypt, and then God goes against the Egyptian gods and then takes them into Canaan where he goes against the Canaanite gods. And so the idea of like wrestling with God, do you think it specifically only means you've wrestled with myself who just wrestled with you, or is it kind of also part of this sort of covenant of saying like, and I'm going to use you, your family, who through Abraham, I also made a covenant with myself, but to Abraham, I'm now kind of making another covenant to you in this way to carry you as, maybe my, not progenitor, but like as my human instrument to go up against these, neighboring pagan gods. Yeah,
I think there's some merit to that. I don't know that I would say he's making a different covenant. I think he's basically confirming the covenant that he made with Abraham and Isaac. And so now it's a covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that he's going to be their God. And I think also there's this, when you were describing, and I agree with you, but also something that came to me is that, so when Isaiah in his servant songs begins talking about the Messiah as the servant, he even calls him Israel. So in this way, Jesus, who wrestled with Jacob and gave him the name Israel, also then becomes Israel himself, the one who is struggling and fighting. And in his case, he's not only striving against men, but he's striving against the false gods and overcoming them. Yeah, by the way, along these same lines, so Jesus is Israel reduced down to one person. Think of it this way. How did Israel begin? One person, Jacob. And then he expands to the 12 tribes, and they expand to all these kids. But then it comes full circle, and it's reduced down once more to one man. Jesus is Israel, embodied. All Israel's in him. And that's why he repeats the activities of Israel. He goes down into Egypt and comes out again. He struggles against the false forces, the dark forces. He goes into the wilderness and he's tempted for 40 days. He's Israel reduced down to one person in order that he might do what they failed to do. And in redoing that, undoing their evil and redoing what they failed to do, he can do it all for us. So in that way, he's also our conqueror by overcoming sin, death, and the devil as Israel is one person. We had a guy, question right here.
You mentioned that Jacob was about 75 when he left, and 20 years later he'd been close to 95. I find it almost unbelievable that a 95-year-old man was wrestling with God.
Yeah. He'd been at the gym a lot in Haran. He's doing weightlifting, running marathons. Yeah, it is pretty amazing. I mean, it does, I think, help to keep in mind the relative age difference. So when he comes back, he's probably close to, I don't know, we'll say a 50-year-old today. And I've seen some 50-year-olds are pretty awesome shape. So I suppose Jacob was one of those guys. Yeah. There's a hand in the back right over here. I don't know how I'm seeing it. Y'all don't realize how blinded I am in the light. I just see dark faces everywhere. Yes.
Can you hear me?
I can.
So when Esau came with 400 men to meet Jacob, what do you think his motivation was?
That's a great question. And I wish that this is one of these cases where I wish, the Bible drives me crazy sometimes. I'm like, tell me more. I mean, I want like extensive footnotes. What was going on in his head? What were his motivations? We can only guess. I mean, so you got several options. It could be that that's how Esau always traveled. I mean, this was a dangerous place, right? So maybe he always traveled with 400 men. Maybe they had been off on a raid somewhere. Who knows? And the servants found them, and so they were already out when this happened. It could be that Esau had no idea about what his brother might try, so he wanted to be prepared. Have his guys with him. There's a lot of possibilities. Whatever was his initial motivation with the 400 guys, what eventually happens is, I think, one of the most touching scenes in the entire story. In fact, it's what the parable of the prodigal son is modeled after. Because when Jacob gets there, he bows down to the ground over and over, coming up to Esau, and Esau runs and embraces his brother and falls on his neck and weeps. And what does that remind you of? That's the father in the parable of the prodigal son. Think about the connection between these two. You got two narratives, both involving a father, two sons, one older, one younger, an inheritance dispute. The younger runs off into a far-off country, and then eventually he comes back, and he is warmly welcomed and embraced by the the father figure. In the parable, it's the father, and in the narrative, it's Esau. So I believe what Jesus did is he took a well-known story from Israel's past and he reshaped that as he told the parable. And he reshaped one thing in a significantly different way. Because when Jacob left, he had a stick. He comes back, he's rich. He leaves empty, he comes back full. The son in the parable leaves full and comes back empty. So Jesus changed that detail in the parable in order to accent this good and gracious character of God, who, first of all, didn't let the son even finish his confession, and who ran to meet him. Didn't wait on the porch with his arms crossed or shake his finger at him. He ran to meet him, embraced him, loved him, and welcomed him home. So, in a strange way, Esau becomes the paragon for the father in the parable of the prodigal son. Amazing. I told our Israeli guide that when we were in Israel, and she was not happy with me. Well, it's right in the Bible. So Esau ends up being the hero. Okay, anybody else? Got a question over here? Okay, got a question here first.
Yeah, why Jacob? So why was Jacob favored over Esau? And in your studies, have you ever come across any reason?
No, in fact, that's one of the great things about this story. Paul will bring this up in his letter to the Romans when he says, before these boys had done either good or bad, God chose Jacob. My hunch is that God chose the worst brother. He didn't choose the better brother, he chose the worst brother to demonstrate his kindness toward us. That he doesn't choose the worthy, he chooses the unworthy. He doesn't choose the better person, he chooses the not better person as an example of his loving kindness toward all of us in Christ Jesus. Yeah. Okay, there's one over here. Yes, ma'am.
I have kind of a comment and a question. First of all, for all the ladies here, why does God seem to, in the Old Testament, permit these men to have so many wives?
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah.
And the second is, I believe it's true that Esau's descendants today are still in conflict with the Israeli nation. Aren't they the Arabs today?
Yeah, a lot of times passed. We'll start with that. So, let me put it this way. Muslims claim their descent through not Isaac, but through Ishmael. So they identify with Ishmael. In fact, if you read the Quran, I'm reading the Quran right now for the second time. It's not an easy read, by the way, but there's a lot of Bible stuff in there, even though Muhammad continually gets things wrong. I mean, even about the Bible, even like basic facts. He's like putting stories together that don't go together. I'm like, are you even Bible guy over here with this? But anyway, so if you read, for instance, the account of Isaac and Ishmael, Ishmael is the one who is the favored son. So that's kind of the root of the conflict there. As far as why God permitted that, I don't know. I mean, there's not really a good reason. There's reasons that you can give, like, well, this was kind of part of the cultural norms, and God didn't see fit to end that. I mean, think of slavery. Slavery was practiced all over the world, in every single culture, up until very recently in human history. Very recently in human history. Well, it's still practiced worldwide. There's millions of slaves worldwide. They're in the sex trade or something like that. So slavery has never ended. So slavery's like that too. It's all over the Bible. So I think there's certain things that God, for whatever his own reasons were, didn't put a stop to. Now, he said what was best. I mean, he created Adam and Eve, not Adam and Eves. You know, it wasn't like, here's your 6 wives, Adam. Enjoy. He created just one wife, and Jesus himself affirms that this is the way God designed it. But, as with a lot of things, you have the corruption of humanity. You have all kinds of terrible things happening, including these very, very dumb decisions of having a polygamous household. And when people say, well, did God ever explicitly forbid that? My response is always, well, no, but all you have to do is read these stories to realize how dumb it was, right? There's not a single good polygamy story like, oh, that really worked out well. We should try that. Yeah, not a single one. It's like, read the stories, don't do that. It's not a good idea. Yeah. Anybody else? We got a couple more questions. How long are we going, by the way?
Probably 2 more questions.
2 more? Okay.
Mine's short.
Okay.
3 more questions.
2.5, yeah.
It always bothers me that it says, when he saw, he was unable to beat him, whatever.
Yes.
Does it read different in Hebrew?
Oh, no, it's the same.
Oh,
Yeah.
thanks.
Yeah, it is the same. Yeah, I think this is nothing more than God is condescending to human limitations temporarily in order to be able to wrestle with Jacob, as he condescends to us still today. Y'all going to wrestle over who gets the next question?
Quick question on the narrative of Rachel. She's mentioned again, I think, in Jeremiah, about Rachel weeping for her children.
Yeah.
I've read different narratives about that, where I wonder if you can speak to that, whether she's weeping for the exiles or if it's the ancestry of Jesus, it would be Leah. So what's your opinion?
Yeah, so if you remember the story, they get back to the promised land, and then Rachel has Benjamin, whom she names Ben-Oni, which means son of my sorrow. His dad changes his name to Benjamin, thankfully. But she dies in childbirth, and she's buried there relatively close to Bethlehem, kind of the Jerusalem-Bethlehem vicinity. Now, that was the point, getting back to your Jeremiah reference, that was the area where the exiles during the Babylonian exile in around the 586 BC, that's where they were deported to Babylon. And so that you have Jeremiah referring to Rachel weeping for her children. So I think he's using her personified as weeping for her children, who would have included the Israelites. I mean, she wasn't the mother of all the Israelites, but still weeping for the Israelites who are being deported. Now, Matthew uses that to talk about Rachel weeping for her children with the slaughter of the babies at Bethlehem. And in that way, he's reading history typologically. He's seeing what happened in Jeremiah's day as a type or foreshadowing of what was going to happen with the slaughter of the innocents there in Bethlehem. I will say one thing, because this didn't come up. I don't think I even mentioned this when I was talking about Rachel and Leah. I love the fact that at the very end of his life, when Jacob is laid to rest, he's not buried with Rachel. He's buried with Leah. It's like one more event of God underscoring the fact that he's choosing the one who was unchosen. He's showing mercy and love to the one who didn't receive a lot of love and mercy from her husband. And he's blessing her then with being buried together with Jacob, as well as being the matriarch from which will come the Messiah eventually. Yeah. Yeah, one more is fun. Yeah. Someone want to close this off with an easy question?
Nobody
Nobody? All
wants
right.
to do
Oh,
it, no.
there is. We got maybe one or. Oh yeah, so that's Jacob wrestling with the angel. That's the way the artist depicted it. It's kind of cool too. Look in the very middle how that's the shape of a heart, where the two of them come together. Yeah, and the stars are nighttime when this was taking place. So that's him kind of depicting in his own way what was happening there. Question? Yes. Last one.
I noticed in Genesis 31, in 2 places, it talks about God as the fear of Isaac.
Mm-hmm.
Probably
Probably terror of Isaac is a better translation. Yeah, but go ahead.
Because I'm not familiar with that as a name for God.
Well, yeah, and rightly so, because it only occurs there. Yeah, that's the only place where that occurs. Yeah, it's not even the regular word for fear in Hebrew. It's a word that means more like terror of Isaac. So I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of speculation. I've read some of the scholarly content on that, and there's a lot more questions than answers. It wouldn't be that unusual to talk about a God being like the fear of someone, because fear is sometimes personified. And this would be, so the God would be the fear, the one that you fear, right? Fear above all things. Now, why a stronger word was used there, meaning more like terror? I don't know. And that's the only place it occurs, so we don't have anything else to compare it with. I wish we did. We'd have a better grasp on why that name was chosen. But for whatever reason, that's the only place that it occurs, is Genesis 31. All right, thank you all so much for coming today. Thank you for Tyler, for this whole congregation hosting us. It's always it's a great joy. It's a gift for us to be able to, my wife and I, to be able to come to churches like this, and we always leave full of joy and full of gratitude and thankfulness for the people of God and how you encourage us. So thank you for coming today, and thank you for being a great encouragement to us.